Hi guys. Tonight let's drift slowly into the shadows of ancient Rome, not the grandeur of emperors or the triumphs of legions, but into something more hidden, more intimate and infinitely stranger. We're about to journey through the most bizarre punishments ever recorded in the Roman world and beyond, punishments that were cruel, ingenious, and at times eerily symbolic. Across 24 long, gentle parts, we'll meet the people who lived these fates, the judges who sentenced them, and the world that shaped them. Settle in and let us begin at the Tiber's edge, where the city hums with distant voices, and justice has a face as strange as it is cold. The late summer air was heavy that morning in the Suburra, Rome's teeming, tangled neighbourhood of insula, brothels, bakeries, and whispered secrets. The sun, not yet high, cast long slants of gold down the alleyways, lighting up the chipped brick and plaster, the wet stone stairs, the hanging laundry trembling in the slight breeze. Somewhere, a vendor called out the price of garum. Somewhere else, a child wept. But deeper in, where the shadows did not easily lift, the guards of the urban cohort were gathering. A man named Malleolus had been dragged from a wine shop the night before. Drunk, they said, loud. His sandals scuffed, his tunic stained with more than wine. But that wasn't what earned him his fate. They whispered that Malleolus had raised a knife to his own mother, not in defense, not in madness, but in a rage as sudden as a summer storm. And now the punishment would follow the crime, not just to correct him, but to warn the others. There was a ritual to it, always. This was not just about punishment. This was about spectacle, about meaning. Rome's laws were not merely rules, but symbols, echoing with centuries of myth, memory, and fear. The punishment for parricide, killing a parent, was older than many of the buildings around them. It was called the poena culae, and it was about to unfold again. They dressed Malleolus in coarse leather, binding his arms so tightly that his fingertips purpled. His mouth had been gagged, but he no longer struggled. Whether it was the drugs, the shame, or the creeping inevitability of what was to come, he moved only when shoved. At the forum, where officials read his crimes aloud, a crowd gathered. Not a large one. Most people had seen enough executions to grow weary, but those who came leaned forward, curious. A few had brought their children. The poena culae was never carried out quickly. There were materials to gather, a leather sack large enough to hold a man, a rooster, a monkey, a dog, a snake. Always the same animals, though no one truly agreed on why. The symbolism had been lost in time, buried beneath generations of retellings. Some said the animals represented the chaos of the unnatural crime. Others said they were meant to confuse the soul of the murderer in the afterlife, sending it adrift without recognition. The sack was brought out near the riverbank, already twitching. The monkey screeched inside, the snake had coiled around the base. The dog snarled, and the rooster thrashed its wings uselessly against the coarse walls. The air smelled of leather, sweat and fear. 2 guards carried Malleolus to the edge. His eyes caught the water, green, thick, slow-moving, and then darted to the sack. For the first time a sound escaped him. Not a scream, not a plea, just a dry, breathless gasp, a goodbye to something already lost. He was pushed in roughly, the animals piled after him. The sack was sewn shut, quickly, brutally. A priest muttered a few words, ritual barely heard, and then the rope was pulled taut. With a grunt, the cohort heaved the bundle into the Tiber, and it vanished with a hollow splash. For a long time, no one moved. The water rippled outward, dark and uncaring. Then slowly, people turned away. The day continued. Children were scolded, bread was sold. Rome moved on. But that punishment lingered in the mind. It lingered not just because it was cruel, because it was strange. There was something almost mythical about it, something that belonged to a darker age. And yet, it had happened here, now, in the very heart of civilization. The poena culae was rare, but it was not alone. Elsewhere, other punishments unfolded in quieter corners. A baker caught mixing sawdust into his loaves had been sentenced to wear a collar of iron and parade through the marketplace, each false loaf dangling from a chain. A senator's slave, accused of whispering secrets to his master's rival, was condemned to the tunica molesta, the burning shirt, where a soaked and pitch-coated tunic would be set alight as he stood bound to a stake, the fire taking him slowly. These punishments were not designed only to kill, they were crafted to haunt, They lingered in the eyes of witnesses, in the tales retold at night, in the drawings scrawled by children on dusty walls. Rome believed in control, but also in fear. And fear, once fed, has many faces. Further away from the city, on the outskirts near the tomb-lined Via Appia, a different sentence was carried out. A thief had been caught entering a mausoleum, not for gold, but for bones. It was a vile thing by Roman standards, a desecration of the manes, the spirits of the dead. His sentence was old, very old, and barely remembered. He would be sewn into the skin of a dead ox and left in the sun. Slowly, as the hide dried and shrank, it would crush him. Not immediately, but eventually. The punishment turned the body into a tomb, a grave wrapped in shame. And as the sun sank behind the red tiles and marble, as the city's noises quieted to a hush, these tales were passed from one whisper to the next, from mother to child, from merchant to apprentice, and through them the warnings continued. Rome was a place of marvels, yes, but also of monsters, and sometimes they wore togas. In a narrow villa beneath the Aventine Hill, where the perfume of crushed olives mingled with the faintest tang of musty scrolls, a magistrate named Lucius Caedicius sat awake past midnight, his stylus trembling faintly in his fingers. A single oil lamp flickered above his writing desk, its flame mirrored in the silvered surface of the ink bowl beside him. He had presided over 3 judgments that week, each more twisted than the last, and now sleep refused to find him. He was no stranger to Roman justice. For decades he had studied the edicts, debated the 12 tables, and issued his own interpretations of senatorial decrees. But lately, something darker had crept into his work, an edge to the punishments, a ritual cruelty that disturbed even his seasoned mind. Lucius reached for a scroll, fingers brushing over the embossed seal, De Suppliciis, on punishments. He unrolled it with care, the parchment dry and thin from age. Lines written by jurists long gone stretched before him, inked in meticulous strokes. His eyes landed on a curious passage. Let no free man be bound to the post unless the offence dishonours the body as well as the soul. That phrase had haunted him since the case of the Vestal Virgin. Just 2 years before, the city had murmured in disbelief when the Vestal Procula, young, serene, barely 20, had been accused of breaking her vow of chastity. The law was ancient, sacred. A Vestal's purity was not just her own burden, but the spiritual foundation of Rome's fortune. The punishment was fixed and had never been altered, not in centuries. No blood was to be spilled. Instead, the guilty Vestal was to be buried alive. The ritual was meticulous, cloaked in religious solemnity. Procula had been led, veiled and silent, through the city streets to the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. It lay near the Colline Gate, desolate, bordered by wind-twisted cypress and low, crumbling walls. There a narrow pit had been prepared, furnished with a couch, a small oil lamp, a jug of water, and a loaf of barley bread. Just enough for her final hours. She had not cried. Lucius remembered that most vividly. As the stone lid was lowered above her, sealing her beneath the earth, she had only whispered something too soft for any to hear. Some said it was a prayer, others said it was a name. But whatever it was, it vanished with her into silence, and above the earth Rome turned its gaze elsewhere. Lucius set the scroll down and rubbed his temples. These were not punishments designed for retribution alone. They were spectacles, laden with symbolism, weighted with fear and theatre. And yet, despite their savagery, they endured. The next morning brought a different sort of judgment. A farmer had arrived from the northern edge of Latium, bringing with him a boy of barely 16, bound at the wrists with flaxen rope. The youth had been caught desecrating a household shrine, smearing ashes across a Lares statue, casting coins into the family cistern while shouting blasphemies. Whether madness or defiance had driven him, no one knew. But the act was clear. He had defiled the spirits of the home. Lucius watched as the boy was brought forward, his eyes wide, darting like a trapped animal's. Dirt crusted his tunic, and blood from a scraped knee had dried in a dark line down his shin. The farmer's face was a study in bitterness, equal parts rage and shame. "He spat on my mother's altar," the man hissed, "said she was dead and the gods were lies." The court fell still. Desecration of the Lares, household gods, was not a crime codified in the main corpus of law, but it was a deep offence against Roman custom and belief. Such transgressions were often handled within the family, but this farmer had dragged the boy here before a magistrate to make the punishment unforgettable. Lucius listened, silent. Then, in a tone colder than the marble beneath him, he issued the sentence. The boy would be subjected to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But not in the grand spectacle of the Colosseum, no. He would face a private arena in the Ludus Magnus, beneath the great gladiator training grounds, where beasts were kept for training and silence ruled. There would be no crowd, no fanfare, just him, a torch, and the den. The punishment was more than death. It was erasure, a way to show that the god's insult had been met with finality. But what troubled Lucius most was not the sentence. It was the thought that the boy, in his half-mad eyes, seemed almost relieved. Later that week, Lucius walked through the streets near the Temple of Saturn, where beggars nestled between columns and children skipped over worn cobblestones. He paused near a public posting wall, where fresh notices had been nailed in place. One caught his eye, Lex Papia, on adulterers and their fate. The law had always fascinated him. Under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis, a man could kill his wife and her lover if caught in the act under his roof. But if brought to court, the punishments varied. Flogging, banishment, confiscation. Yet what few remembered was the shame sentence. An ancient punishment revived in whispers. The adulterer was to be paraded naked, save for a wreath of fig leaves, painted blue with woad, and ridden through the forum backwards on a donkey, to the jeers of the watching crowd. The ritual was meant not to kill but to degrade, to leave a stain no exile could cleanse. And sometimes the sentence extended to the lover's family. His father fined, his mother forced to fast in mourning, as if the act of shame had rippled outward through blood. Lucius had only seen such a sentence once, years before. A patrician youth, son of a senator, had been caught in the bed of a noblewoman. The scandal had been suffocating. He had wept as the paint was applied to his skin. He had collapsed as the donkey was led through the streets, and in the end he had vanished, whether by self-exile, suicide, or silencing, none could say. And all of this, Lucius thought, was wrapped in Rome's great illusion, that law was order, that punishment was justice. But he knew he had seen too much. He returned home that evening and looked once more at the scrolls. The flickering lamplight made the ink dance as if the ghosts of the condemned whispered from the margins. In Rome, justice was not blind. It had eyes wide open, and they looked with judgment, yes, but also with imagination, a strange, brutal imagination. The night deepened. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then again. Lucius did not sleep. The dawn crept over the rooftops of Rome like a hesitant breath, gilding the tips of terracotta tiles and dappling the pale stone of crumbling columns. In the Forum Boarium, where cattle once changed hands beneath the gaze of the god Hercules, another transaction was preparing to take place, not of animals or goods, but of judgment and pain. A crowd had gathered, though no horns had sounded, no criers had summoned them. They had come by instinct, drawn by the slow murmurs of a punishment rarely seen. It was not the poena colli this time, nor the slow death by beast or fire. This was older still, more rooted in the soil of Rome's earliest laws, from the time when kings still sat on thrones and the city was more myth than state. A thief had been caught, an older man with hands too quick for his age and eyes too calm for his crime. He had not taken bread, nor clothing, but something far more serious. The bronze scale weights from the Temple of Saturn, sacred property protected by the gods themselves. The theft had been silent, precise, perhaps even desperate. But now it would be answered with a sentence almost forgotten. Per duellio, the old punishment for betrayal and sacrilege. He was to be scourged publicly, then executed by being thrown from the Tarpeian rock. There were few punishments more symbolic in all of Roman tradition. The Tarpeian rock was a sharp precipice that jutted from the southern face of the Capitoline hill, its edge jagged and sun-bleached. In the early days, when kings ruled and treason threatened at every corner, traitors had been flung from its heights, not just to die, but to be flung away from the heart of Rome, cast out both in body and in meaning. The old man did not beg as he was led forward. His name was Vibius. No one knew much of him. Some said he had once served in the legions, others that he had once owned a tavern near the Circus Maximus. But whatever he had been, now he was only a vessel for justice. The lictors led him slowly, the rods of their fasces visible under the morning sun. No one sang, no one shouted. The silence of the onlookers was louder than any cry. They watched as Vibius was tied to the whipping post, his back bared and arms stretched wide. The first blow fell with a dull crack. Then another, and another. The scourge was leather, tipped with metal. It did not tear so much as grind, drawing blood in long, rough welts. After the scourging, he was lifted to his feet. His knees buckled, but he did not fall. The path to the Capitoline was long, winding past temples and marble statues, past children peering from behind columns and merchants who pretended not to see. At the summit, near the old temple ruins, the rock awaited. It was not a long fall, but it was enough. The crowd watched as the body was cast down, limbs flailing briefly in the air before silence took him. He struck the stones below with a sound like a jug shattering, and his blood painted the rock red. The crowd dispersed shortly after, as always, returning to their bread, their prayers, their lives. But among them was a girl, perhaps no more than 13, who had watched everything from the shadow of a pillar. Her name was Lelia, daughter of a freedman, and something in her eyes that morning shifted. She had seen death before, yes, but this death was different. It was planned, choreographed, reverent in its way. She would carry it with her, quietly, like a poem half-remembered. Elsewhere in the city, another punishment was being prepared, not for theft or treason, but for words. A poet named Domitius had published a satire so sharp it was said to peel the skin off its subjects. Senators were named, habits mocked, the emperor hinted at beneath layers of clever verse. It was meant to entertain, perhaps to protest, but in a city where image was everything, it was a dangerous game. He was arrested at dawn, his scrolls confiscated, his home sealed. No trial was held, not a public one. Instead, he was sentenced under the charge of maiestas, a vague, sprawling accusation that covered anything deemed disrespectful to the dignity of Rome. But Domitius was not to be killed. His punishment was stranger, exile from Rome and the erasure of his name. Every copy of his verse was to be burned, every bust of his face destroyed. His home was to be auctioned, his belongings scattered, and from the record of the city he was to vanish. This was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The Romans understood the power of remembrance, and they knew that to erase someone was a fate worse than death. To be forgotten, to have one's deeds unwritten, one's name struck from walls and stones, that was a kind of oblivion that reached beyond the grave. They painted over his name in red, then carved it away. Statues that bore his likeness were melted down or defaced. His friends dared not speak of him, and in time even his enemies forgot why they had hated him. But a single copy of his satire survived, hidden in a sealed jar beneath the floor of a bakery near the Porta Esquilina. It would not be found for nearly 3 centuries, and when it was, no one knew who the poet had been. But his words lived still, unnamed, immortal. Back on the Capitoline, as the sun reached its zenith, priests washed the stones beneath the Tarpeian rock with wine and rosemary, not to cleanse them, but to honour them. Rome did not weep for the punished. Rome remembered, and, when necessary, Rome erased. That evening, beneath the sweeping arches of the Aqua Claudia, the shadows stretched long and strange across the earth. Water coursed through the great stone veins above, a soft and distant rush that seemed to hum with the weight of centuries. Below, near the shade of a wild fig tree, a group of slaves whispered among themselves, heads bent close, voices hushed and trembling. One of their own had vanished the day before. Taken, quietly, in the middle of a delivery route near the Esquiline Gate. His name had been Cyrus, a Thracian by birth, tall and soft-spoken, with a limp from an old wound and a talent for carving fine details into ivory combs. No one had seen him since the Praetorian guards seized him. But the whispers knew. He had been caught teaching letters to another slave. And for that he would suffer a punishment that was not written in law, but remembered in bone and blood. The Domus Pansa, a villa near the Aventine's lower slope, had become infamous in certain circles, not for its marble, nor for its lavish feasts, but for what happened in its courtyard. There a peculiar punishment unfolded from time to time. Ligatio lingua, the binding of the tongue. It was reserved not for runaways or thieves, but for those whose words threatened the delicate fabric of control. slaves who taught, who preached, who stirred curiosity where only obedience was desired. Cyrus, they said, had been made to kneel before the household shrine. His arms had been stretched behind him, bound to the base of a statue. A wooden wedge had been forced between his teeth, and his tongue drawn forward with a silver hook. No blade was used. That would have been merciful. Instead, a heated bronze brand carved in the shape of a stylus had been pressed against the tender flesh. Enough to burn, not to sever. Enough to scar, to silence, to remind. He did not die. That was not the intent. He was returned to his master's workshop the next day, his mouth swollen and silent, eyes dull with pain. He could still carve, he could still bow and serve, but he could never again teach. And when asked what had happened, he only looked away. Not all punishments in Rome were public. Some were crafted for the home, for fear to breed in silence. But in the heart of the city, near the theatre of Pompey, a different sort of spectacle unfolded. There, a wealthy widow named Octavia had recently been tried for poisoning her fourth husband. The evidence was thin, yet the murmurs had grown too loud to ignore. Her household had long been a source of scandal, servants vanishing, physicians paid in secrets, and a trail of sudden deaths cloaked in polite silence. Rome tolerated excess. It even tolerated vice. But when it crossed into murder, the public thirsted for consequence. The punishment Octavia received was one rarely invoked, aqua igni interdictio, the interdiction from fire and water. On the surface, it sounded almost benign, but it was, in truth, a social execution. She was forbidden to own property, forbidden to live in the city or any Roman province. She could not receive fire from another's hearth, nor draw water from any public source. She was, in essence, exiled not just from place, but from society itself. She left Rome veiled, with only 2 slaves permitted to accompany her. Her villas were seized. Her name was struck from the guest lists of every feast. And though she still breathed, she had been unmade. Wherever she went, people turned their faces. Inns refused her. Markets shunned her. She wandered south, they said, toward the marshes of Campania, where the world grew thin and the sea swallowed all memory. But Rome's punishments did not only touch the guilty. In a squalid tenement near the Janiculum, a boy no older than 10 sat watching his mother prepare flatbread over a small, smoky hearth. She worked with tired hands, flour streaking her arms, her shoulders bent under the weight of poverty and the weight of something worse, secrecy. Her husband had been accused of desertion months ago, dragged from their home by the military tribunes. No word had come since, but the punishment had arrived all the same. It was called infamia. A stain upon the name, a mark not just on the man, but on his kin. With her husband dishonoured, the woman lost her right to appeal in court. Her son could no longer be enrolled in any formal tutelage. Their ration cards were reduced. Their neighbours began to whisper, then to withdraw. Infamia was not swift, it was not bloody, but it was as cruel as any execution. It was a slow strangling, done with bureaucracy and silence, one breath at a time. Yet within all of these stories, one thread remained constant: the careful, almost ritualistic precision with which the punishment was matched to the crime. Rome did not deal in random vengeance. Its cruelty was deliberate, measured, symbolic. A soldier who deserted not once but twice was not merely executed. He was forced to dig his own grave, strip off his armour and kneel as his fellow soldiers stoned him. It was not for the sake of death, but for the sake of unity. His betrayal washed away by the hands of those he had abandoned. A woman who performed illegal abortions was not simply imprisoned. She was stripped naked, tied to a wooden yoke, and paraded around the city's sacred groves, forbidden ever again to touch another life. A man who falsified his citizenship, a crime worse than murder in some circles, was subjected to capitis deminutio maxima, the total loss of status. He was no longer a Roman, no longer a legal entity. He could not marry, could not testify, could not inherit. To the law, he no longer existed. And all the while, the city moved on. From the rooftops of the Palatine to the muddy banks of the Tiber, life pulsed forward. Punishments came and went. Names were forgotten. Stones were washed clean by rain. But the memory of Rome's strangest judgments remained. Not in the monuments, not in the scrolls, but in the glances exchanged in alleyways. In the silences between words, in the way a child fell suddenly quiet at the sight of a certain building. For in Rome, fear had many voices, and some of them still whispered. That morning, the fog had not yet lifted from the lower banks of the Tiber, and the city was wrapped in a veil of pale grey. A gentle dampness clung to the bricks of the insulae and the cloaks of early market-goers, whose carts creaked like distant thunder as they rolled through the narrow lanes. Beneath the arch of the Cloaca Maxima, where the sewer's ancient breath rose in a fetid steam, a small crowd had begun to gather. Not for commerce, not for worship, but for a sentence spoken in the dark of the Senate chamber the evening before. A man named Calvus had been condemned. He had not killed, he had not stolen. What he had done was far more subtle, and, to some, far more dangerous. Calvus was an augur, trained in the sacred rites of reading omens from the flight of birds, the entrails of goats, the shifting clouds above the Capitoline. But he had been caught lying, deliberately falsifying auguries for the benefit of a patrician client. A harvest festival delayed, a marriage cursed, a trial moved 3 days forward, all at his whispered suggestion. In Rome, to lie in the name of the gods was to infect the divine order. The punishment was an old one, drawn from the earliest priestly laws. Exilium sacrilegi, ritual exile by public disgrace. He was to be shaved completely, head and brow and beard, then coated in ash and wrapped in a yellowed shroud like the dead. A bell would be tied around his neck, not as a warning to others, but so that the gods, it was said, could hear him coming and turn their faces away. Then he would be walked through every sacred gate of Rome, denied entry by the priests at each, until he reached the Porta Flumentana, where he would be cast out onto the muddy banks of the Tiber and left. No one was to speak to him. No food was to be given. No prayer was to be said on his behalf. He emerged just as the sun began to burn through the fog, his skin pale against the ash, his eyes hollow. A child wept when he passed, though she didn't know why. An old man spat at his feet, and yet he said nothing, simply walking, step by slow step, until he vanished into the mist. Elsewhere, in the bustle of the Campus Martius, 2 slaves faced a different fate. They had fought, not in defence, not in chaos, but with purpose, over a spilled amphora of olive oil and an insult about lineage. Their masters had demanded punishment, but not death. Instead, they were given supplicium de manibus, the punishment of the hands. They were to be bound back to back, each with a shard of pottery in one hand, and left beneath the statue of Mars Ultor for a single day. Neither was allowed to move unless he wished to harm the other. They bled. They cried. But the law held that they must not be separated. If one dropped the shard, the other had the right to strike. It was not about pain. It was about submission. By nightfall, one had collapsed from blood loss. The other knelt beside him, trembling and silent, lips cracked with thirst. A single centurion lifted them both and carried them away. Neither spoke again for weeks. And in the high courts, under the golden dome of the Basilica Julia, a new case had begun. A man named Mestrius, a wealthy grain merchant, had been found guilty of manipulating the grain supply during the last famine. His ships had not been late, as he claimed. They had docked secretly in Ostia, their loads sold to private clients at 4 times the fair price. For this crime, hoarding and deceiving during a time of scarcity, the penalty was not simple. The Senate demanded something more poetic. His punishment was called panis alter, the bread of vengeance. Mestrius was to be locked in a granary for 3 days, surrounded by the very sacks of grain he had once denied the people. But none of it would be for him. Instead, he would be fed scraps of spoiled barley bread and stagnant water, while around him the pure wheat rotted slowly in sealed bags. Torches would burn constantly, the air thick with heat and the heavy perfume of mildew and dust. Each hour, a single child, one of those he had deprived, was permitted to throw a handful of grain at his feet, not in charity, but in scorn. They said Mestrius did not cry until the 2nd day, when a boy too thin to stand properly raised his hand and said nothing at all, just looked at him, then turned and walked away. He was released, barely conscious, and ordered to donate his entire fortune to the city's grain fund. But even so, the stigma lingered. People threw crusts at his cart in the street. A mosaic artist defaced his likeness in a public bath. And in the Senate his name was never spoken again. Far from the city's grandeur, beyond the reach of the 12 aqueducts, another punishment played out in the flickering firelight of a village court. A woman named Fausta, born free but married to a cruel and petty landholder, had been accused of cursing a neighbour's cattle, not poisoning them, not harming them with her own hand, but speaking words by moonlight, placing poppy seeds in a circle, whispering at the edge of the field. In Rome, magic was feared but also exploited. The wealthy used it in secret, but the poor, when they did it, it was seen as rebellion. Fausta was tied to a wooden post in the village square, but not burned. Instead, the magistrate ordered her to be flogged with nettles, a local variant of the urban scourge. Each strike did not draw blood, but raised welts that burned for hours, some for days. Then she was made to walk in circles around the cattle pen for a full night, under guard, repeating a single phrase, "Let what is theirs return to them, and what is mine remain." By morning she collapsed, her sentence complete. Her guilt neither confirmed nor erased. She was left to recover in the stable of the same family that had accused her. None spoke to her, not even the cattle. In Rome's eyes, the punishment was not always about truth. Sometimes it was about order, about fear, about performance. And in the shadows of every column, in the echo of every whispered prayer, those performances lived on. Under the heavy blue of the late evening sky, the Palatine Hill stood silent and dignified, its mansions and temples casting long silhouettes against the fading light. The wind shifted lightly through the cypress trees lining the crest, and below, in the quiet lanes that twisted beneath the noble estates, another kind of silence spread, a silence not of peace, but of expectation. It was the night before the punishment of a man named Sabinus. He had been a herald once, his voice firm and clear enough to carry across the forum even in the din of midday. His robes had been neat, his bearing stately, and his words, always the words of others, delivered with unerring precision. But Sabinus had grown bold. He had begun to alter the words he proclaimed, just slightly. A phrase softened, a sentence reversed, enough to shift meaning, enough to confuse, enough to give advantage to the wrong men. Sabinus had corrupted the voice of Rome, and the punishment was as symbolic as it was severe. He was to be sentenced to mutilatio vocis, the mutilation of the voice. Not death, not exile, but a carefully measured vengeance. They did not cut his throat, nor burn his tongue. Instead, he was bound, and a small heated rod, sharp as a needle and tipped with silver, was inserted beneath the jaw, along the root of his tongue, and through the roof of his mouth, severing the passage that allowed speech, but leaving him alive, conscious and intact. He could breathe, he could swallow, but no words would ever form again. When he was returned to the Forum days later, he stood beneath the rostra, where once he had announced decrees to cheering crowds. Now he stood still, mute, a wax tablet hung from his neck that bore a single line, "He lied," for gain, and lost his voice. Children stared at him. Merchants pretended not to see. But among the senators and magistrates, the point had been made. To lie with one's voice in Rome was to forfeit it. Not far from the city's heart, in the baths of Caracalla, another ritual unfolded. This one, slower, quieter, and entirely hidden behind the sheen of oil and marble. The victim was a bathhouse slave named Nicostratus. He had been accused of seducing a citizen's son. No witnesses, no bruises, only a whispered confession under duress, drawn from a youth afraid of his father's wrath. That was enough. The owner of the bathhouse, eager to prove his loyalty to his clients, chose a punishment from the old Greek traditions, once imported to Rome but rarely practiced anymore. It was called campsimo, a twisting. Nicostratus was tied with wet leather cords to a wooden beam, ankles bound to wrists, his spine bent in a way not meant for the human frame. Then the cords were tightened slowly, and as they dried under the heat of coals, they shrank, bit by bit, minute by minute. Not enough to kill, only to disfigure. When they finally cut him free at dawn, his arms were twisted, his gait broken. He would never serve again. And in that punishment, his body bore the guilt Rome did not care to prove. Back in the Forum, an elderly senator named Hortensius faced another fate, not of flesh, but of lineage. He had falsified his son's adoption documents to pass land rights illegally. Not a violent crime, not even a particularly surprising one. But it had been uncovered in a year of scandal, and the Senate had grown weary of improprieties. The punishment was ancient, rarely spoken of. Abrogatio patriae potestatis, the revocation of paternal power. Hortensius was summoned before the censors, stripped of his symbols of office, and declared dead in the eyes of his own family. His son, previously adopted, was returned to his former guardians. His grandchildren were forbidden from taking his name. His family altar was declared impure, the household gods removed and buried at the edge of the city. He returned to his home in silence and found it changed. His slaves had been reassigned. His wife had taken the name of her father once more. The domus that had borne his name now bore no name at all. He was alive but fatherless, wealthy but unclaimed. He could not sue, could not attend family rites, could not even be buried in his own tomb when the time came. He had not only lost his rights, he had lost his place in the line of Roman time. In the southern districts near the Circus Maximus, a lesser-known punishment was carried out in secret. A prostitute named Callista had been accused by a senator of sorcery, claiming that a love charm she had given him caused him to neglect his duties. The accusation was absurd, but she was foreign, Greek-speaking, clever with herbs, and worst of all, unrepentant. Her sentence was drawn from the Etruscan rites, aqua noctis, the drowning of night. She was taken at twilight to the Tiber's edge, blindfolded, arms wrapped in heavy cloth, a small clay figurine tied to her wrist. The figurine, shaped in her likeness, bore her name etched in Greek script. It was cursed in silence by a priest, and then dropped into the water. She was not drowned, but she was submerged 3 times, held down until the river took her breath, then pulled up. Enough to frighten, to humiliate, to remind. When she was released, coughing, her ears filled with silt and riverweed, the figurine was already gone. For the rest of her life, Callista refused to touch water again. She bathed in oils, avoided fountains, and crossed aqueducts only by closed cart. Rome's punishments were not always fatal, but they always marked, and in every alley and every market, every shrine and sewer, the memory of them moved, silent and invisible, like smoke through cracks in marble. The rain had fallen lightly through the night, misting the rooftops with dew and softening the dust between the paving stones. The city stirred slowly that morning, wrapped in a hush as if Rome itself were holding its breath. On the northern slope of the Celian hill, beside the weather-worn tombs of forgotten equites, another sentence was about to be carried out, one that few citizens had seen in their lifetime. The condemned was a woman named Drusilla. Once a priestess of Ceres, she had served faithfully for more than 2 decades, known for her calm eyes and steady hands. But rumours had grown thick around her in recent months, whispers of hidden rites conducted outside the official calendar, rites that included unsanctioned offerings, foreign invocations, and, most damning of all, private consultations in exchange for coin. The priesthood was sacred. To sell its mysteries was a breach not only of trust, but of Rome's pact with the gods. Her punishment was drawn from a time so ancient that even the pontifices debated its proper method. It was known only by an older name, Claustrum Sacrum, the sacred enclosure. Drusilla was taken to a subterranean chamber beneath the temple of Ceres itself, down a staircase slick with moss and thyme. She was given neither chains nor guards. The door was sealed behind her with hot pitch and a copper seal stamped by the high priest. No food would be brought, no water, only the temple's silence and the offerings she herself had once made. A clay bowl of barley, a folded white veil, a small bronze sickle. It was said that she would be left there until the gods themselves decided whether she was guilty. If she was innocent, they would show mercy, but mercy never came. Above ground, worship continued. Children brought flowers, senators made donations. No one spoke of the sealed room beneath their feet. But now and then, on particularly still days, a whisper of incense, too old to burn, seemed to drift from the cracks in the stones. Elsewhere, in the heart of the Subura, a man named Attilius was sentenced in a way that was quiet and yet devastating. His crime was forgery, not of coin, but of wills. He had forged the signature of a dying uncle, replacing a fortune's inheritance from his cousin to himself. It had worked for a time. But the cousin, sharp-eyed and meticulous, had noticed a difference in the lettering, in the flow of the final sentence, and brought the matter to court. The magistrate sentenced Attilius to restitue in effigy, a symbolic punishment meant to erase honour through theatre. A wooden figure was carved in his likeness, head shaven, tunic torn, and nailed to a high post in the forum. Upon it were written his name and his crime, along with a false version of his inheritance claim. I take what is not mine and give it back in shame. The figure was then beaten in public, lashed with birch twigs as Attilius stood watching, bound and silent. But the punishment did not end there. He was ordered to walk each day past that effigy as it remained in the forum for one full lunar cycle. He could not avert his gaze. He could not speak to others. He was to bow before it each morning and again each night. The crowd watched not him, but the likeness. The beating was not for his flesh, but for his name, and when the month ended, the effigy was burned, but Attilius's social status had already turned to ash. On the outskirts of the city, where vineyards curled up the hillsides and shepherds still led flocks past worn Etruscan stones, another kind of judgment unfolded. This one was not enforced by Rome, but by tradition, older perhaps than the Republic itself. A farmer named Lentulus had violated a boundary stone. To the average Roman citizen, this would seem absurd. But to the countryside, to the descendants of those who had first plotted out the sacred division of land, it was sacrilege. The stones marked more than property. They marked balance. To move one was to invite chaos, drought, or worse. The punishment was known simply as lapsus termini, the fall of the boundary. At dusk, Lentulus was led to the field where the offence had occurred. The villagers gathered in a half-circle, holding torches, their faces unreadable. An old priest stepped forward and traced a line in the soil with a staff of yew. Lentulus was instructed to lie down, belly to earth, arms stretched wide along the original path the stone had marked. Then, slowly, the priest walked the length of his body, pressing the staff into his back, reciting a litany that named every offence against nature. Not loud, not cruel, just steady. When he reached the end, Lentulus was doused in wine, smeared with ashes, and told to rebuild the altar of stone with his own hands. He was not arrested. He was not exiled. But for a year, no one shared food with him. No one helped him lift a basket or mend a fence or carry a child. He lived as if invisible, and in that invisibility, Rome's old gods spoke. Even in the cities, the ancient traditions endured. In a lesser temple near the Aventine docks, a woman named Menasha, caught stealing figs from an offering bowl, was sentenced to noxia poma, the fruit of guilt. Each day for a week she was made to carry a basket of figs through the market, offering one to each passerby who would listen to her say the same words, "I stole what was sweet, and now I give what is bitter." The figs were coated with vinegar and ash, nearly inedible. Most refused them. Some laughed, but the performance worked. By the week's end, her name was remembered, but not with rage, with pity. Because in Rome, punishment was never just about the body. It was about the gesture, the symbol, the echo that lingered in the street long after the blood had dried or the words had faded. And every punishment, no matter how strange, became part of the city's great performance, its theatre of order, pain, and meaning. The sun rose red over the Janiculum hill, casting a warm amber glow across the terracotta roofs and the gently rolling mists still clinging to the valleys below. The sound of temple bells echoed faintly from the east, mingling with the distant bleating of sheep and the rhythmic creak of a cart axle somewhere deep within the morning hush. And at the base of the hill, in a long-forgotten courtyard, tucked behind an overgrown garden of cypress and laurel, an old punishment was being prepared, one spoken of only in hushed tones, like a superstition never quite forgotten. A noblewoman named Livia Graccha had been accused of incestus, a term that in Roman law held not merely the weight of its modern meaning, but the broad implication of ritual impurity. She had crossed boundaries not marked by flesh, but by lineage, tradition, and expectation. She had taken a lover who, by blood or law, should have been forbidden, whether it was her nephew, her stepson, or something even stranger. The records did not say. But the Senate had taken notice, not for the scandal, but for the sacrilege. She had served as matrona sacra, a sacred mother in the rites of Bona Dea, and thus her body had been tied to ritual purity. Her crime was not judged as betrayal alone, but as a spiritual contamination. For this, she was not to be burned, nor stoned, nor buried alive. Her punishment was obductio florum, the veiling of flowers. In the courtyard, a small stone basin was filled with crushed petals, roses, hyacinths, iris, and poppy, all steeped in salted water. Livia was brought forth, draped in the long mourning veil of widows, though she had never been widowed. Her wrists were loosely bound with white thread, not as chains, but as symbols of her sacred obligation undone. She was led barefoot into the basin, the petals clinging to her feet and calves, the salt water stinging the bruises beneath her knees. There a chorus of priestesses, neither kind nor cruel, chanted the rites of separation. They did not accuse, they did not weep, they spoke with the calm finality of a seal being pressed into wax. After the ritual, Livia was not sent to prison. She was not exiled in the formal sense, but she was forbidden from entering any sacred space for the rest of her life. No temple, no feast, no wedding procession. Her name was removed from the rolls of the priesthood. Her shrine at home was to be turned toward the wall, her household gods buried in a box outside the city gate. For a woman like Livia, who had lived her entire life within the sacred rites, it was a punishment worse than death. She continued to live in her home, fed by loyal servants, visited by no one. Even her voice, once lifted in hymns, grew quiet with disuse. The flowers that once crowned her hair now bloomed only in memory. But while Livia faded from view, the city turned its gaze to a more public matter. A performer named Demetrius, famed for his pantomimes, his impersonations of senators, gods and ghosts, had finally gone too far. In a recent performance at the theatre of Balbus, he had mimicked the emperor himself, twisting his features with exaggerated elegance, imitating his mannerisms with a biting perfection that made the audience roar with laughter. It was too much. Imitating the emperor, especially in a manner that provoked derision, was a serious crime, a violation of the unspoken boundary between spectacle and sovereignty. The Senate demanded a punishment not just for him, but for all who might follow his path. He was sentenced to confractia personae, the breaking of the mask. This punishment was both symbolic and brutal. Demetrius was taken to the very stage where he had performed, stripped of his costume and bound to the wooden floorboards. Before him, a bust of the emperor had been placed, cast in bronze and polished to a mirror shine. Then, from above, the masks of comedy and tragedy, symbols of the theatre itself, were lowered on ropes and smashed upon the floor beside him, one after the other, until only shards remained. Finally, a mask carved in his own likeness, painted with the delicate colours of stage makeup, was placed upon his face. It was not secured, it was simply pressed there, and then, with a single strike from a hammer, it was shattered. The fragments cut into his skin, lightly, purposefully. He was not to die. But his face would never again be a canvas for laughter. His mouth, once so quick with mimicry, healed crooked. His cheek bore the impression of painted wood for months afterward. He was allowed to live. But he never returned to the theatre. Further south, in a wine-producing village along the Appian Way, a punishment as old as Sabine custom was being practiced. A baker had been caught adulterating his flour with chalk and ash, a crime that, in the city, might earn a fine or imprisonment. But here, among the villagers, it was something deeper, a betrayal of trust, a corruption of daily bread. The punishment was panis mortis, the bread of death. At dusk, the baker was tied to the grinding stone, his hands dusted with the very chalk he had used to deceive. He was not whipped nor maimed. Instead, he was made to grind a full sack of grain into flour with his own strength, barefoot and sleepless, while the villagers took turns baking loaves from the grain and placing them around him in a circle. Each loaf bore a mark carved into the crust, a skull, a cross, a single tear. By sunrise, the circle was complete. The loaves were not eaten. They were burned ceremonially, and the ashes scattered at the edge of the fields, a warning to all. The baker was released, but he was never again allowed to touch a millstone. He left the village within days. These punishments, though varied, carried the same cadence. Not just to discipline, but to illustrate. To reflect guilt back upon the guilty with mirrors forged of symbol, ritual and silence. Rome did not merely punish, it remembered. And that memory was etched into its stones, its rituals, its very breath. The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the hills beyond the Janiculum, casting long golden rays across the rooftops and temple domes of Rome. It was the hour when shadows grew tall and the city exhaled, when shopkeepers drew down their awnings and priests lit evening lamps with slow, reverent movements. But this evening, a strange procession wound its way down the Vicus Tuscus, from the Tarpeian slope toward the river Tiber, silent and curious as a dream. At its centre walked a man named Gaius Minucius Regillus, formerly a doumvir in one of the smaller municipia of Etruria. Accused not of violence nor of theft, but of hubris, too great an ambition, too openly voiced. He had commissioned statues of himself, spoken too proudly of his lineage, worn purple beyond the border of his office. In a city like Rome, where hierarchy was sacred and symbols carved power into granite, such overreach was dangerous. His punishment was one of spectacle and subtle cruelty, mutatio statuarum, the reversal of the statues. Each effigy he had erected in his honour was located, dismounted and altered. His name was scratched off the plinths and replaced with titles of mockery: friend of himself, prince of vanity, master of shadows. Then, in a ritualized procession, one of the statues was dragged through the streets, its head reversed, its hands removed, and displayed on a low platform near the river, facing the city with its back. Gaius himself was led behind it, forced to mirror the statue's posture, arms tied behind, chin forced down by a leather strap, body turned slightly away from the city he had once tried to conquer with praise and marble. He was not jeered. That was not the Roman way. But the silence of the crowd was a condemnation deeper than insult. By the time the sun dipped beneath the rooftops, both the statue and the man had been left at the edge of the Forum Holatorium. The statue remained for a month. Gaius did not. To the south, near the Porta Capena, another kind of theatre unfolded within the household of a Roman matron named Cornelia Lucilla. Her offence was deeply domestic, and yet it rattled the very framework of household power. She had struck her husband, not in passion, not in defence, but in open argument, during a dinner with guests, with a wine jug in hand and fury in her voice. Roman law was imbalanced by design. A man could strike a wife under certain conditions, often without consequence. A woman doing the same, especially of noble blood, disrupted an entire worldview. The punishment was vinctura cineris, the binding of ash. Cornelia was led to her own hearth by 3 elder women from her husband's family. There, she was made to kneel and cover her hands and face with cold ash drawn from the kitchen fire. Her mouth was bound with wool, not to gag but to symbolize the silencing of discord. A cord of faded red was tied around her shoulders, fastening her arms loosely to her sides. She was to remain that way until the next dawn, while her husband slept in another room, and her servants brought her no comfort beyond a cup of barley water at midnight. In the morning, the ashes were swept into a small urn and placed on a shelf beside the family lares. A reminder, a quiet scar. And in the same breath with which one household remembered, another in the district of Regio 6 prepared to forget. A freedman named Tiro had committed a crime that was not meant to be known. He had forged documents granting himself a share in a merchant company, faking endorsements from 3 long-dead partners. When it was discovered, the law responded with something cold and final. Consumptio nominis, the consumption of the name. He was not publicly tried. Instead, a magistrate read the verdict in a back room of the Praetorium. A wax tablet bearing his name was broken in 2 and burned. All contracts in which he was named were cancelled. His seal was melted down and thrown into the latrine pits. But the punishment reached further. Anyone who spoke his name in public could be fined. Anyone who referred to him in letters had to describe him as ille qui non est, he who is not. Even his family was instructed to remove his name from ancestral records. His epitaph was erased from the modest tomb he had built for himself outside the Porta Latina. He did not disappear. He continued to live, quietly, under a new name. But his past, his identity, had been consumed by flame, ink and silence. And in a city that treasured memory, to be forgotten was a punishment that hollowed the soul. Elsewhere, in a villa surrounded by olive groves near Ardea, a rural punishment preserved from older tribal customs was administered with quiet resolve. A youth had betrayed his master's trust, not by stealing coin or damaging property, but by revealing, drunkenly, the household's ritual calendar to an outsider. In rural families, these calendars governed planting, marriage, birth, and even death. To speak them aloud to a stranger was a kind of sacrilege. The punishment was verba invento, words into wind. The youth was led blindfolded into the fields before dawn. There a line of oil lamps had been placed, stretching between the grove and the low hills. He was instructed to speak the household rites aloud again, every word, every date, every invocation, until the lamps were extinguished by the wind. He did so, voice shaking, breath misting in the cold, and as he recited, the wind picked up, carrying his words across the olive trees into the valley, away. By the end, his voice had gone hoarse. The final lamp guttered, and no one spoke. He was sent away, barefoot, to wander until sunset. When he returned, the rites were rewritten, the calendar changed. He was not expelled, but the old rituals would never again be spoken in his presence. All of these punishments, strange, quiet, elaborate, shared a single purpose, not just to discipline, but to shape memory. Rome punished not only the body, but the name, the voice, the place one held in the fabric of time. And in every district, in every family, from the grandest senator to the humblest olive farmer, that memory lingered, sometimes in ash, sometimes in silence, sometimes in stone turned backward, watching a city that no longer saw it. The Tiber rolled slow and black beneath the starlight, carrying reeds and fragments of bark down from the hills as it had done for centuries. The bridges above it stood like silent sentinels, their arches silvered by the moon, each stone resting heavy with the weight of passage. And just beyond the ponds Fabricius, where the air smelled faintly of mud and warm olive oil, the punishment of a man named Lucullus was drawing to its strange and final hour. Lucullus had once served as a lictor, a keeper of law and order in the city's bustling heart. He had carried the fasces, enforced the will of magistrates, and stood at the edges of bloodied executions with hands clasped, face unmoved. But somewhere in those years of duty, something in him had bent. A coin passed here, a whispered name there. Slowly he began to trade silence for silver. He ignored certain smuggled shipments at the docks. He looked away when illegal duels unfolded at the edge of night. The Senate might have forgiven greed, even manipulation, had it not been for one final act. Lucullus had altered the written order of punishment for a senator's son, replacing scourging with exile. The discovery had been quiet, but the response would not be. He was sentenced to recursus poenarum, the punishment of the reversed lash, a symbolic ritual, rare and reserved for those who had corrupted justice while wearing its colours. It required no bloodshed, only theatre and shame. Lucullus was brought into the forum in full lictor's garb, crimson-edged tunic, leather shoes, and a ceremonial fasces in hand. But each rod in the fasces had been painted with black ash, and the axe was replaced with a cracked mirror, bound into the bundle with copper wire. He was instructed to walk the length of the forum, alone, turning to face each magistrate's seat along the way and bowing, not with pride, but with apology. As he reached the end, he was met by a silent column of younger lictors, each holding a fasces upside down. One by one, they passed him, tapping the back of his knees lightly with their rods, not enough to wound, but enough to force him to kneel, again and again, until he could barely stand. By the end, the mirror had shattered in its bindings. And Lucullus, once the bearer of Rome's judgment, was judged in turn. He lived, but was never again permitted within the walls of a magistrate's hall. His name was erased from the lictors' rolls, and every fasces he had once held was burned in a midnight pyre near the Temple of Justice. The ash was swept into the river. Further north, in a quieter corner of the Esquiline Hill, a different kind of penalty unfolded in the soft hush of a private garden. A boy named Faunus, barely 16, had been discovered painting obscene images on a public shrine wall, crudely drawn figures of gods with lewd inscriptions carved in charcoal beneath their likenesses. It might have passed as childish rebellion, but the shrine he chose belonged to Vesta, and that changed everything. Blasphemy, when committed against the gods of the hearth, demanded a response that mingled shame with purity. His punishment was Pictura Pudoris, the painting of repentance. He was not beaten. He was not jailed. Instead, he was brought at dawn to the garden of a priestess of Vesta, where a blank wall had been prepared. There, with pigments made of milk, crushed eggshell, and white ash, he was ordered to paint over and over the same image. A small, flickering flame held by clean hands, watched over by a veiled figure. Each time the image was completed, water was poured over it, washing it away, and he began again, 7 times by midday, 7 more by nightfall. His hands trembled, blistered from the lime, streaked with the dust of repentance. When the priestess deemed the wall pure, he was sent away, not cursed, but changed. And in the weeks that followed, the same flame he had painted began to appear across the city, carved into stone corners, chalked onto archways, as if he had taken the image into his bones. Near the port of Ostia, where the wind carried salt and the cries of sailors echoed through the alleys, an elderly grain ship captain faced a very old punishment, one that had not been carried out in full since the time of the early Republic. He had sold rotten grain to the army during a famine. Knowing full well the cargo was spoiling, he had concealed the stench with strong herbs, replacing mouldy sacks with cleaner ones only at the surface. The result had been sickness in 3 legions. His sentence was called Cibum Mendici, the meal of lies. A public table was set up in the port square. Upon it, dishes were placed, loaves baked with sawdust, wine soured with vinegar, olives soaked in brine too long to be palatable. He was made to sit and eat, while sailors, porters and dockhands watched. With every bite, a herald read the names of the soldiers who had fallen ill under his deception. He was not allowed to refuse the food, nor to speak. By the time he reached the final plate, a bowl of raw barley paste, thick with ashes, he was barely conscious. He survived. Barely. But his ship was seized, its name scraped from the prow, and he was forbidden from ever sailing again. Even the sea, it seemed, had turned its face from him. And finally, in the shadow of the great statue of Mars Ultor, a punishment was administered to a woman whose crime had no blood, no theft, no godly insult, only arrogance. She was called Terentia, a midwife who had begun advertising miracle births, making promises to barren women that they could bear children if they paid her enough. She had performed no magic, only whispered lies, sold herbs mixed with sand, and smiled with false certainty. When one of the women died from a mixture she had brewed, a young wife of a respected equess, the illusion shattered. Terentia was sentenced to partus vanus, the false birth. She was dressed in a thick gown stuffed with wool, her belly exaggerated with linen until she appeared swollen with child. Then, in the square before the temple of Juno Lucina, she was made to kneel and announce with a false cry the coming of a child. Midwives surrounded her, not with aid, but with questions. What name? What omen? What offering? When she gave no answer, the linen was cut, the wool removed, and the emptiness revealed. The crowd did not cheer. They only watched, the silence cutting deeper than any lash. The scene was recorded by scribes and shared as a warning, and Terentia, once called upon with reverence, was now greeted only by locked doors. Rome's punishments were strange, yes, but beneath their cruelty lay something colder still. Design. A sense of story, a shaping of fate through humiliation, symbol, and silence. And in every whispered tale, every statue turned backward, every name etched in chalk and wiped clean, that story endured. As the first cool breath of dawn swept over the Campo Marzio, the city stirred like a creature slowly waking from its sleep, the gold-flecked clouds drifting above the capital, casting a faint rose hue upon the marble. Smoke rose in slim columns from bakeries and bathhouses, carrying the soft scent of barley and thyme through the narrow streets. Yet beneath the quiet hum of routine, there moved a current of anxiety. For today would bring a rare punishment, one older than any recorded law, preserved only in the secret rituals of the pontifices and remembered through whispers in shaded corners. A foreign merchant named Basilius had been convicted of an ancient crime, violating a boundary stone between the sacred and the profane. He had knowingly built a stall within the Pomerium, Rome's holy perimeter, where no foreign trader, no tool of war, no outsider was permitted to linger. His excuse was ignorance, his defenders few, and his punishment inevitable. He was sentenced to sulcus damnationis, the furrow of condemnation. This punishment harkened back to the time of the city's founding, when Romulus himself, according to legend, had drawn the sacred line of Rome with a plough pulled by a snow-white ox and a black bull. The furrow marked the border between the divine order and the wild, the known and the forbidden. To trespass it without right was not just a civil offence, it was cosmic imbalance. Basilius was brought, bound but unbloodied, to the original point where the Pomerium had once been drawn. There, before a crowd of senators and priests, a wooden plough was passed over the earth, not pulled by oxen, but by men of noble birth. A single shallow trench was carved in a half-circle around the place where his stall had stood. Then Basilius was forced to kneel inside it. He was not struck, he was not cut. But as he knelt, each magistrate in turn dropped a clod of earth from the trench upon his back, pressing him slowly lower until his shoulders bowed to the earth he had defiled. When it was over, the trench was filled in, levelled, planted with lavender and rue, and Basilius was given a single coin and banished from the city. He would never return. Across the city, another ritual unfolded in the shade of the Basilica Aemilia. A senator's daughter named Valeria had been caught in a deception both calculated and delicate. She had disguised herself as a slave, binding her hair, marking her arms with soot, and entered the Ludus, the gladiator training grounds, where she conducted a secret affair with a young Thracian fighter. Not only had she defied her station, but she had endangered the order of caste and spectacle, crossing a line as sharp as any drawn blade. The punishment invoked was corolla servitutis, the slave's wreath. Valeria was not beaten, nor shorn, but she was placed in the forum, seated upon a low stool used by slaves during auctions, her fine robes replaced with a simple tunic. Upon her head was placed a corolla, a circlet made of dried laurel and vine, the kind worn by servile entertainers. For 3 hours she sat beneath the eyes of the city's elite, silent, hands folded, as if awaiting sale. People passed by without speaking. Her former tutors ignored her. One young woman dropped a coin at her feet, not in cruelty but in pity. That coin was never retrieved. When the sun reached its zenith, she was quietly led away. She was not disowned. But for 1 full year, her name was forbidden from public announcement. Her betrothal was cancelled, and when she returned to society, her eyes rarely met another's for long. In the theatre district near the Tiber Island, a very different punishment was playing out, one veiled in absurdity, yet weighted with deep humiliation. A cook named Platorius had been discovered poisoning his employer's rival, not fatally, but enough to cause a scandalous and very public bout of illness during a banquet. The weapon was not steel, but sauce. The tool, not dagger, but fig paste laced with a purgative herb. The offence was both intimate and theatrical, and so the punishment would be likewise. He was sentenced to Coenamendax, the banquet of lies. A stage was set in a public courtyard, a table laid with lavish dishes, silver cups, garlands, and wine vessels. Platorius was seated alone, clothed in the garb of a freedman's feast, bright, too fine, too loud. One by one, actors emerged to serve him imaginary dishes. Each course was introduced with flourish, roast peacock, honey-glazed dormice, lampreys in saffron, and then replaced with nothing but air. Platorius was required to respond to each invisible dish with gratitude, chew, swallow, and compliment the flavour. Every word he spoke was recorded, and bystanders laughed, but not cruelly, more in awe of the precision of the ceremony. By the end of the banquet, he was full of shame, not food. He was released that night with a basket of dry bread and a jar of unsalted lard, the true meal of his offence. He never cooked again for the elite. Instead, he opened a tavern near the fish market, and on the wall hung a single plate, empty and polished to a shine. Farther from the centre, in a grove where no temples stood, a punishment of solitude and sound was underway. A young woman named Postumia had been caught spreading seditious songs, verses mocking the consuls, mocking the courts, mocking Rome itself. They were clever, and they spread fast, sung softly in the streets, etched into walls with bits of charcoal. She was not a rebel, she was a singer. But in Rome, even melody could become a weapon. Her punishment was silentium resonans, the echoing silence. She was taken to a quiet glade, encircled by columns and carved stones, and seated at the centre with a small bronze bell placed beside her. No one would speak to her, no one would sing. She was to remain there until sunset, forbidden to hum, to whisper, to make a sound. Each time she did, the bell would be struck, not loud, just enough to mark the violation. And so she sat eyes wide, throat tight, as birds called in the trees and insects hummed through the air, and every time her lips parted, the bell sang her shame. When she was released, she was not punished further, but she never sang again in public. And yet, in the weeks that followed, others began to ring small bells in alleyways, not in mockery, in memory. Rome punished with fire and stone, with silence and spectacle, with ash and garlands. And each act of justice, no matter how strange, became another verse in the song of a city that remembered everything, especially those it chose to forget. The winds from the Alban hills carried with them the scent of laurel and pine as they wound their way through the narrow streets of Rome, brushing against the togas of senators and the worn cloaks of beggars alike. Along the Via Sacra, the stones glistened faintly from the previous night's rain, and above them the clouds hung low and luminous, as if waiting to witness the strange rite unfolding in the Forum Boarium. A man named Septimus Modestus, once a respected scribe within the treasury, stood alone beneath the bronze statue of a long-dead consul. His offence was not one of theft or fraud in the traditional sense, but of memory, deliberate, methodical erasure. For reasons never fully made public, Septimus had begun destroying civic records, quietly, carefully. Birth rolls, grain allocations, tax ledgers, names, dates, lives. Not many, but enough to cause uncertainty. Enough to blur the lines that held the empire's bureaucracy together. His punishment was a ritual known in hushed tones as memoria fracta, the breaking of memory. He was led to a wooden bench surrounded by the records he had falsified, but they were not to be burned. Instead, scribes, those same quiet, ink-stained keepers of the empire's order, began to read them aloud in turn. Each name, each figure, each place he had tried to remove was spoken into the air and echoed off the surrounding marble. And each time a name was read, Septimus was required to speak it back, loudly, without error. If he faltered, a single drop of ink was placed upon his tongue, not poison, but enough to stain, to choke, to mark. By the end of the rite, his mouth was black, his voice hoarse, his tunic stained with the memory he had tried to bury. He was not executed, but he was assigned to the archives of Ostia, Rome's port city, where he would spend the rest of his life copying ledgers in silence, surrounded by names he would never forget. Across the river, beneath the shadows of the Aventine, another ritual had begun to gather attention. In the Temple of Concordia, where disputes were once resolved in solemnity, a husband and wife knelt on opposite ends of the altar. Their names were Gnaeus and Aemilia, and their marriage had become infamous, not for infidelity or violence, but for open hostility. They had brought lawsuits against one another over property, over servants, over silence. They had shamed the ideal of Roman harmony. The priests had issued a judgment older than law, vincti manibus, the binding of hands. In this ritual, neither was declared right or wrong. Instead, they were bound at the wrists with a braided cord of flax, knotted 12 times, once for each year of their union. They were then ordered to walk the perimeter of the Aventine Hill in complete silence, unable to separate, unable to speak, forced to move together as one. The punishment lasted from sunrise to the ringing of the evening bell. If they stumbled, they were not helped. If they quarrelled, the cord was tightened. By the time they returned to the temple steps, their hands were raw, their faces sullen, and neither had spoken a single word. The marriage was dissolved quietly a week later. But long after, other couples passing through Concordia's precinct would pause at the old cord, now preserved in a niche along the wall. It remained, braided and brittle, a reminder of union turned bitter, and the price of public discord. Farther afield, beyond the Celian Hill, a slave named Phaedo faced an unusual punishment, one designed less for him than for those who watched. He had struck his master. Not fatally, not in open rebellion, but in a moment of rage, provoked by hunger and cruelty. The law permitted death. But the master, an old senator with a taste for spectacle, had demanded something stranger. The sentence was umbra in catena, the chained shadow. Phaedo was taken to a courtyard at dawn, and a wooden post was fixed into the ground at the precise angle to catch his shadow in full when the sun stood highest. A long iron chain was draped across the ground, and as his shadow stretched across the earth, it was marked with pegs and stones. At noon, when the shadow reached its longest, it was chained in place, its outline bound by cord and metal, as if capturing a soul. Then Phaedo himself was bound to the post, within the space of his shadow. He could not sit, nor fully lie down. His body was held in mirror to the form cast beneath him, as if punished for what he had projected, not what he had done. The chain was never locked to him, only to the shape he made. By sunset, the shadow had vanished, and with it the sentence was lifted. But the watchers, slaves, magistrates, strangers, left with a strange unease. A man punished through his reflection, his presence turned against him. In another part of the city, near the Temple of Janus, a girl was being punished for impersonation, not of nobility or priesthood, but of prophecy. Her name was Varia. Barely 15, she had claimed to hear whispers from the gods, delivering omens to those who paid in coin or bread. Her words had stirred unrest. A merchant delayed a voyage. A young widow refused a marriage. A soldier struck down a fellow soldier in fear of what she had foretold. The priests, angry not at her youth but at her presumption, sentenced her to vocis mutatio, the unmaking of voice. It was not physical. No tongue was cut. Instead, she was led into the inner sanctum of the temple, blindfolded and barefoot and surrounded by 12 robed officials. Each one whispered a word, strange and sacred, into her ear. These were not insults, but syllables of forgotten rites, fragments of language so ancient they carried power simply in being spoken. She was told to repeat them all. She failed, of course. No one could remember what was never meant to be known. But with each mistake, the priests added another word, and by the end, her voice faltered, overwhelmed by meaningless sound. She was led out gently, her lips still moving, repeating fragments that no longer made sense. She would speak again, but her voice, once clear and persuasive, now trembled with broken rhythm, and the city, which had once listened, now turned away. These punishments, each stranger than the last, carried within them a strange coherence. They were not only meant to correct, they were meant to echo, to leave behind a shape, a silence, an image burned into the consciousness of the city. Rome did not erase its crimes with blood alone. It etched them in symbol, in gesture, in the trembling air between two words never meant to be spoken aloud. The light over the rooftops of the Kelian hill was sharp and white by mid-morning, filtered through veils of dust that rose with the day's activity. Across tiled courtyards and the open plazas of Rome's southern districts, the sounds of chariot wheels, murmured bargaining, and distant hammers echoed softly. Yet on this day, a curious stillness gathered near the eastern edge of the forum, near a colonnade draped in dark cloth, where a boy of noble birth knelt in silence. His name was Marcus Calpurnius Lento. He was 17, the son of a senator, educated in rhetoric and law, expected to ascend into civic life as predictably as the sun rose over the Palatine. But one error had cast a shadow over his ascent. He had struck his tutor. The tutor, an aging Greek named Demetrius, had taught generations of Rome's elite. In the eyes of the Senate, he was not merely a slave, but a bearer of the sacred flame of knowledge. For Marcus to strike him, and worse, to do so in public during a dispute in the Basilica Julia, was seen not as petulance, but as an assault upon the very ideals of Roman dignity. The punishment was saltus eruditionis, the leap of learning. Marcus was summoned to the forum by his father, who stood without sword, without lictor, only a tablet bearing his son's sentence. In a public courtyard, 12 scrolls were laid out in a ring, each containing a passage of law, history, philosophy. Marcus was required to walk slowly in a circle, reading each aloud, before stepping inside and reciting them from memory. He could not. Of course he could not. And each time he failed, a young slave, barefoot, dressed in the simplest tunic, was brought forth to recite it in his place. And each time they succeeded, Marcus was made to kneel. This continued until the circle closed, and Marcus stood surrounded by those he had thought beneath him. The message was clear. Wisdom and station were not the same. He was released in silence. For the remainder of the year, his name was struck from all invitations to oratory contests and debates. To some, it was mercy. To others, a wound deeper than any lash. That same afternoon, on the edge of the Subura, an older and far more sombre punishment took shape in the peristyle of a modest domus. A widow named Plautia had committed an offence so personal it could scarcely be spoken aloud. She had refused the burial of her husband. Not a refusal out of poverty or even hatred, but of indifference. She had left his body untouched for days, allowing the neighbourhood dogs to circle the house. The stench had reached the next street before a neighbour intervened. The priesthood of Libitina, goddess of death and funerals, responded with a ritual not seen in years. Os in ignem, the mouth to flame. Plautia was not fined, nor exiled. She was made to sit beside a low brazier in her courtyard, surrounded by clay vessels containing offerings that she had failed to make. A bust of her husband, carved hastily in plaster, was placed before her, mouth open. Each hour, a priest added a coal to the brazier, and she was told to whisper a lament, a phrase of mourning, something to acknowledge the dead. She said nothing. By the 6th hour, her voice cracked. By the 9th, she wept. When the brazier died down, the bust was shattered with a hammer and its fragments buried in the garden. His memory returned to the earth, no longer in her care. In another quarter of the city, beneath the colonnades of the Porticus Octavia, an artisan named Herenus faced his own judgment. Not for theft nor violence, but for pride taken too far. He had carved his own likeness into a statue of Neptune commissioned by the city. It was not subtle. The god's face bore the exact features of Herenus, his tools left visible at the statue's base, as though daring the public to notice. And notice they had. The punishment was simulacrum fractum, the shattering of the double. The statue was not destroyed. Instead, it was unmounted and brought to the forum. Herenus was made to watch as artisans, his peers, chiselled his features from the stone, not violently, but slowly. Each stroke was precise, removing only enough to distort, to efface, to leave the god faceless. Then, with brushes and pigment, they painted the gap in bright red, mocking the blood that might have been drawn had the offence been greater. Herenus was not imprisoned, but he was forbidden from sculpting human forms again. From that day forward, he worked only in leaves, in lions, in labyrinths. And though his skill remained, no one ever again saw his name carved into marble. Beyond the city, in a quiet farming village near Tibur, a punishment from the days of the old Italic tribes was revived in response to a growing concern: neglect. A landowner named Flaccus had allowed his fields to rot, not from famine, but from disinterest. He had invested in imported wines, lived in the city, and returned only to collect rent. The grain had failed, the workers starved, the land fell into ruin. The villagers, with permission from a rural magistrate, enacted legatio frumenti, the binding of the harvest. Flaccus was led through his own fields with a yoke of straw across his shoulders, each bundle representing a missed sowing, a failed reaping. At every marker where a crop had died, he was made to kneel, press his forehead to the earth, and remain until the village elder struck the ground beside him with a hazel switch. The ritual lasted from dawn until dusk. By the end, his knees bled, his fine sandals shredded by thistle and stone. He was ordered to restore the land himself, by hand, with no servants for 3 seasons. Only after the fields bore wheat again would his estate be restored. In every corner of Rome and her territories, punishment was not merely about justice. It was remembrance made manifest. Whether through voice or flame, silence or kneeling in dirt, the weight of wrongdoing echoed across flesh, stone and time. Each act became a chapter in the living scripture of order. And though the city moved ever forward, its aqueducts flowing, its forums buzzing, its temples ringing with praise, it carried those echoes with it. Not to condemn, but to remember. As dusk settled over the rooftops of the Aventine Hill, the sky turned a muted purple, casting long shadows that stretched like ancient hands over the winding streets below. Torches sputtered to life along the walkways of the Forum, and a hush fell over the Palatine, where the soft clinking of bronze wind chimes whispered in the warm air. It was on this twilight edge of day that a punishment both rare and deeply symbolic was unfolding near the Temple of Saturn. A woman named Scribonia, a noble matron from one of the old patrician houses, had been accused of violating the sanctity of testamentum, the sacred trust of the will. Her elderly father, dying and half-mad with fever, had dictated his wishes to her, naming a freedman as heir to a portion of his estate, the son of a man who had once saved his life in Gaul. Scribonia had nodded, smiled, held his hand, and then quietly replaced the tablet. The freedman's name was gone by morning. When it was discovered, no voice was raised in court, no soldiers came, but the College of Pontiffs, keepers of oaths and solemn bindings, decreed her fate, testis umbrata, the shadowed witness. In a public atrium near the tabularium, a single wax tablet was placed upon a lectern. It bore no name, no record. It was blank. And Scribonia was brought before it, veiled in black from head to foot, hands bare, eyes downcast. A scribe read aloud a will, not her father's, but one fabricated from ancient phrasing and forgotten names. With each line she was asked to repeat the final clause. She could not. Each failure brought a whisper from the gathered crowd. Not jeering, not accusation, just soft, overlapping whispers. She did not see, she did not hear. she did not remember. The ritual lasted less than an hour, but it marked her more deeply than any wound. From that day forward, no oath she made could be accepted in court. She could not bear witness, could not serve as executor, could not even serve as a guardian for her own grandchildren. She was alive, but her word was shadow. Meanwhile, in a bakery nestled between the theatre of Marcellus and the old cattle market, a lesser but no less peculiar punishment had been carried out just after dawn. The baker, a thick-necked man named Rufus, had begun stretching the state-issued bread rations with sand, not so much that they were inedible, but enough to dull the taste, enough to cheat those whose lives depended on every ounce. The ration loaves were sacred in Rome. To alter them was to interfere with the very trust between people and empire. His punishment was called panis reversus, the inverted loaf. Rufus was not imprisoned. Instead, he was ordered to make 100 loaves, each using the same measure, the same ingredients, but shaped in reverse. The crusts were placed on the inside, the soft grain pressed outwards. They looked malformed, grotesque, but not spoiled. Then, for 5 days, he was made to serve them free to the public from his own stall, beneath a sign that read, "This is the bread I gave before." Children stared, some laughed, others, out of hunger, ate in silence, and Rufus, pale with shame, did not speak once. On the 3rd day, a woman pressed a warm, intact crust into his palm and said only, "My son felt sand in his teeth." He dropped the loaf. In the temple district of Regio VIII, a punishment of more sacred origin was being performed behind the thick curtains of a shrine to Jupiter Dolicenus. A Roman officer named Velius had broken a sacred fast, consuming meat during the hours of ritual silence, then denying it under oath. Not to a court, but to the god himself. The priests summoned him to undergo silentium ruptum, the broken silence. He was placed alone in the innermost chamber of the temple, surrounded by bronze bells, none of which rang unless touched. For 3 nights he was forbidden to speak, to sleep, or to leave. Only the god, they said, would know if the silence was kept. Each hour a priest entered to observe him, touching one bell with a feathered rod. If it rang, the silence was considered broken. Whether by thought, breath, or the tremble of guilt, the sound was believed to reflect divine displeasure. On the 2nd night, a bell sang faintly at midnight, no more than a whisper. Velius never heard it, but the priests did. He was removed at dawn, shaved from crown to chin, and given a single coin bearing the god's name to wear around his neck for the rest of his life. He was not cursed. But he was no longer allowed to serve in temples or swear oaths in sacred spaces. And all who saw the coin knew what it meant. Across the river, in a district of marble workshops and dye-splattered robes, a punishment of curious aesthetic was carried out against a woman named Catulla, known for her skill in painting funerary masks. She had been caught crafting a false mask of a noblewoman still living, selling it to a rival family as a kind of cruel prophecy, a death in effigy meant to sow fear or superstition. The offence was not legal blasphemy, but social sabotage, a kind of artistic witchcraft. The punishment was lava veritatis, the mask of truth. Catulla was summoned to the tomb where she had deposited the false mask. There, before a small crowd of artisans and family members of the nearly slain noblewoman, she was handed a clean wax form and instructed to paint her own face upon it, without mirror, by memory alone. Each brushstroke was watched, each line judged. When she had finished, the mask was placed beside the false one, and all present passed before them, deciding which more truly resembled her. The mask chosen was the flawed one, cruder but earnest, and so the second was shattered. And Catulla's own mask was placed in a niche within the tomb above a line of carved stone that read, "What we shape returns to us." She left the city within the month. Rome's punishments were not bound by steel alone. They lived in gesture, in silence, in mirrors and masks, in reversed loaves and forgotten names. In a city that sculpted identity from ceremony and rumour, punishment did not simply correct. It transformed, and the city watched always, not with pity, but with memory. The morning mist rose like steam from the stones of the Via Flaminia, curling along the colonnades of merchant stalls and licking at the feet of marble statues as if to remind Rome of its ancient ghosts. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of trampled rosemary and the earthy tang of last night's spilled wine. In the distance, a horn called out once, long and low, and across the Forum of Nerva a peculiar wooden contraption was being assembled. This morning's punishment was not one of blood, nor fire, nor chain. It was a performance. But beneath its theatrical veneer lay a wound cut straight to the heart of Roman vanity. A tailor named Lucius had taken to boasting of his influence over the nobility. In hushed tones and tavern corners, he claimed to have dressed senators for secret rites, to have known which generals wore charms stitched into their sleeves, to have handled robes soaked in illicit perfumes meant to sway juries. It might have been dismissed as tavern gossip had he not written these stories in verse. The scrolls spread quietly at first, then furiously. Names were guessed, inferred, and finally believed. Marriages strained, alliances frayed. The tailor's tongue, clever and silvered, had wrapped itself around reputations far beyond its station. His punishment was Panis Mendax, the cloth of lies. In the Forum, before a gathered crowd, Lucius was presented with bolts of dyed fabric, gaudy, mismatched, stitched together from discarded silks, rough linen, and burlap. Each swatch bore a symbol, a laurel, a wolf, a stylus, a sword, icons tied to the men and women he had defamed. He was ordered to fashion a single tunic from these pieces. It took him 3 days. When it was done, it looked less a garment than a costume, and that was the point. Then, on the 4th morning, Lucius was dressed in his creation and led through the city in a mock triumph, not on a chariot, but on a wheeled stool pushed by apprentices. Behind him, actors recited lines from his poems, but twisted back upon him, every lie told now mirrored in shame. At the end of the procession, the tunic was removed, folded carefully and placed in the archives of the urban prefect. It would never be worn again, but it would be remembered. In the district of Transtiberim, a woman named Aelia faced her own reckoning, though it came not with spectacle, but with silence. She had served as a notary, entrusted with witnessing vows, recording contracts, sealing last words. But she had begun to sell erasure. For coins, for favours, for silence itself, she altered records, backdated promises, unwrote debts. When it came to light, by a single document left untouched and thus revealed by its absence, the priesthood of Fides, goddess of trust, intervened. The punishment they enacted was tabula vacua, the empty record. Aelia was brought into the temple precinct, where a great clay tablet was set upright in a wooden frame. It had been fired too early, rough with cracks and imperfections. Across its surface no words were written. Instead, a stylus was placed in her hand. She was told to write her name. When she did, the priest struck the tablet once, sharply, with the butt of his staff. The tablet shattered. Then another was placed before her. Again, she wrote. Again it was shattered, 7 times. After the last, she was given a shard from the final tablet, bearing only the first letter of her name, and told to carry it forever in a pouch around her neck. It was her only remaining mark upon the records of Rome. Further out in the vineyards beyond the Porta Appia, an aging winemaker named Spurius was called to answer for the sin of deceit through sweetness. His vintage, sold as divine and rare, had been thickened with honey, tinted with elderberries, masked with herbs to mimic age. Patrons from as far as Hispania had praised his cellars. The deception was discovered only when a legionary returning from service recognized the scent of a cheaper local brew, one he'd drunk as a boy. Spurius's punishment was vinum falsum, the false pour. He was brought to the Forum Olitorium, where amphorae stood tall and marked. Each bore his name, etched in the old rustic style. From them, passers-by were invited to drink, but not of wine. The jars were filled with bitter water, steeped in ash, vinegar, and oak bark, substances that imitated wine to the nose, but soured the mouth. Each drinker, after sipping, was to say only one phrase aloud, "This is what he gave me." By mid-morning, the phrase echoed across the market like a song. "This is what he gave me." Spurius was not whipped, not fined. But when he returned to his vineyard, he found his vines had been cursed with red ribbons by local priests, and no one, no merchant, no neighbour, no traveller, would drink from his barrels again. Across the Capitoline Hill, high among the steps of the tabularium, a punishment was being performed not upon the living, but upon the legacy of one who had died unjudged. His name was Marcellus Veturius. Once a powerful jurist, he had died suddenly, leaving behind a dozen volumes of legal opinion, many of which were still cited in court. After his death, letters emerged, letters written to governors, merchants, and judges, filled with suggestions, inducements, veiled favours, bribery disguised as counsel. The Senate, unable to try the dead, invoked a right reserved for those whose legacy had outlived their honour. Reductio sapientia, the reduction of wisdom. Each scroll written by Marcellus was brought forth and placed on a table in the law court. One by one, scholars read a line aloud. If the line bore soundness, it was underlined in ink. If the line bore ambiguity, it was struck through. If the line suggested corruption, it was burned. By the end, only 3 fragments remained. The rest became smoke, drifting through the halls where once he had walked, nodding gravely. A statue once planned for him was melted down. The metal was recast into a bench, plain, unmarked, cool to the touch, and placed in a public park. It bore no name. Thus did Rome punish even those it had once elevated. And through every alley, every shrine, every whispered breath between judgment and absolution, the city remembered, not with rage, but with form, with gesture, with symbols that clung to memory like ivy to stone. The streets of Rome were veiled in fine dust as the wind stirred from the direction of the Sabine hills, rustling the awnings of market stalls and lifting the hems of tunics. Midday bells had not yet rung, and the city stood in that moment of quiet equilibrium between labour and rest, when even the Tiber seemed to drift more slowly beneath its bridges. In the shadowed atrium of a domus near the Forum Piscarium, a man named Aulus Petronius awaited a punishment devised not to scar the skin, but the soul. Aulus had been a patron, wealthy, well-connected, a giver of dinners and legal protection. But he had broken the pact of fides, the sacred bond between patron and client. He had abandoned a dozen men to financial ruin, denying their appeals, ignoring their petitions, selling their debts to crueler hands. When summoned, he claimed forgetfulness, overwork, accident. But Rome did not forget what honour demanded. His punishment was domus inversa, the reversed house. In the presence of his clients, senators, and 3 scribes of the urban prefect, Aulus's home was stripped of all markers of dignity. His family portraits were turned to face the walls. His household gods, the Lares, were placed backward in their niches. The dining couch was upended. His tunic was sewn inside out and dyed with pale ash water. Even the water clock in the courtyard was reversed, draining from top to bottom in symbolic defiance of the natural order. For 7 days his clients were permitted to walk his halls freely. They did not damage. They did not steal. But each morning they left a single item in his atrium. An empty cup, a broken sandal, a coin too bent to use. A reminder of the promises he had not kept. On the 8th day the portraits were turned again. But his name, once etched in silver on a bronze plaque near the door, had been filed away by a silent hand. Further east, near the Porta Viminalis, a ritual unfolded not in the grandeur of domus or basilica, but in the confines of a communal bath. A freedwoman named Lollia had been accused of a deception that struck at the intimate rituals of Rome. She had dyed her skin and hair to pass herself as an Egyptian priestess, selling sacred ointments and incantations by candlelight to women seeking love, fertility, or revenge. It was not her foreignness that drew Rome's ire, nor even the money she earned. It was the impersonation of divine authority, the blending of sacred mystery with street theatre. Her punishment was aqua vana, the water of falsehood. The punishment was conducted at the Balnea Publica, where Lollia had sold most of her secrets. She was brought to the central pool at sunrise, clothed in the white linen she had worn during her false rites. Then, in front of a small, watching crowd, she was bathed not by attendants, but by 2 mute women, one blind, the other lame. Each woman poured water over her, whispering no prayers, offering no words. The water had been laced with the same dye Lollia had used to alter her appearance, and as it flowed across her skin, it carried away the illusion. Bit by bit, the dark pigment left trails down her arms and back, revealing the truth beneath. When they were finished, she was wrapped in a grey cloak and told to walk the entire length of the baths, dripping and silent. No chains, no guards, just the quiet sound of her feet on wet tile and the watching eyes of those who had once believed her. She vanished from the city the following week. Beyond the Servian wall, along a dusty road flanked by shrines and fig trees, a punishment of a much older kind was taking shape, one invoked only when civic memory was threatened. A scholar named Tetius Cimber had falsified his role in a recent campaign in the East, claiming to have served under generals he had never met, and composing memoirs filled with invented speeches and victories. The public had embraced his tale. The veterans had not. His punishment was called spolia ficta, the false spoils. A single day was chosen. A field was cleared outside the city, not far from the tombs of the fallen. There a triumph was staged, not in marble, but in mockery. Tetius was placed upon a wooden cart, dressed in second-hand armour, crowned with dried olive branches. Before him walked a column of actors bearing paper shields, papier-mâché horses, and banners stitched with nonsense Latin. They chanted invented victories, shouted his name with practiced rhythm. As the cart passed by, veterans of the real campaign stood in silence, their arms crossed, their faces unreadable. Some wore their medals, others held their discharge tablets. At the end of the road, the cart was halted. The armour was removed. The olive crown was taken and burned in a brazier. Tetius was handed a scroll containing the names of the real dead, those who had perished in the campaign he had claimed to win. He was told to read each name aloud. When he finished, no one clapped. No one spoke. He placed the scroll in the ashes and walked away, his steps slow and unsteady. In the high colonnades of the Curia Julia, another form of judgment was unfolding, not upon a person, but upon a practice. A group of merchants had been caught fabricating scarcity, hiding goods to drive up price, then releasing them to create frenzy. This was not new, but the scope was massive. Oil, salt, barley, wine, entire storehouses had been emptied by design. The Senate convened, and instead of fines or confiscation, they delivered a collective punishment known as mercatus mutus, the silent market. For 5 days, no transaction in the forum was permitted to be spoken. All trade had to be conducted with hand signals, tablets or tokens. No haggling, no cries, no singing vendors, only gestures. At first it confused and amused, then it strained. Buyers hesitated, sellers fumbled. Confusion bred suspicion. The market, once a roaring heartbeat of the city, moved in near silence. On the 6th day, words returned, but the lesson remained. The forum had tasted what it meant to trade without trust. And so had the merchants who watched their power dissolve without a single coin changing hands. Rome's punishments, though diverse in form, shared a single thread: revelation. Whether through inverted garments, broken silence, dyed skin, or empty noise, each act peeled back a lie, exposed a truth, restored a balance. And through it all, the city watched, not with vengeance, but with an artist's patience, shaping each life as clay, not merely to punish, but to remind. The air above the Palatine Hills shimmered with late summer heat, curling the edges of awnings and making even the doves beneath the eaves fly slower, more reluctantly. A dry stillness blanketed the city, and the fountains bubbled with less urgency, as though the water itself was weary. Yet inside a quiet atrium shaded by grapevines and ancient fig trees, a punishment of curious subtlety had begun to unfold. A punishment measured not in pain, but in perception. A man named Publius Rutilius had committed what some called a minor offence, but one that struck at the very essence of Roman decorum. As a census official, he had fabricated ranks, elevating unqualified men to higher classes in exchange for bribes and removing others without cause. The crime was not one of wealth or bloodshed, but of status distortion, a quiet rearrangement of Rome's invisible scaffolding. His sentence was specula falsa, the mirror of falseness. He was not beaten or exiled. Instead, he was confined to a room within the temple of Ops, goddess of wealth and records, for 5 days. There he was surrounded by polished silver mirrors, none of which reflected true. Each one had been subtly bent, curved, warped in such a way that when he gazed upon his own image, he saw not his face, but strange versions of it, one bloated, one shrunken, one smeared, one grotesquely noble. Each day, he was made to stand before them and identify the real reflection. He never could. On the final day, the priests led him from the room. They did not scold, they did not speak, but they placed in his hand a polished disc of bronze, unmarked on one side, mirrored on the other. It showed nothing clearly, only the hint of his outline, forever blurred. He kept it with him always, and from then on, never spoke a man's name without hesitation. In a courtyard near the Temple of Diana on the Aventine, a punishment was being prepared for a woman named Severina, once a respected midwife. Her skill was known across 3 regions, and her name had appeared in letters exchanged between noble households. But over time, something in her changed. She began to refuse poor women, unless paid more. She demanded gifts before attending the dying. She had even, it was said, abandoned a labouring slave when a richer client called. No court condemned her, but the matrons of the city did. They enacted custodia partis, the guarding of birth. One morning, Severina was summoned to a quiet house under the pretense of a labouring woman in distress. When she arrived, she found not pain but silence. The home was empty, save for 3 veiled figures who led her inside. There, in a darkened room lined with swaddling cloth and water basins, she was made to wait. For 3 days. Each hour, the cry of an infant, recorded, echoed, mimicked by a pipe, filled the room, then faded. Food was brought, water offered, but no birth occurred. Only the endless repetition of what she had once ignored. When she was released, no explanation was given. She spoke little of what happened. But from that day forward she attended every mother, rich or poor, with a devotion that verged on worship. To the north, along the banks where the Tiber widened and slowed near the gardens of Mycenaeus, a punishment of poetic structure played out among the sycamores. A playwright named Gallio had plagiarized the verses of another, an obscure tragedian whose words had been lifted nearly line for line and passed off as his own during the Floralia festival. The original writer had died in poverty. Gallio had earned applause. His punishment was versus reflexus, the reversed verse. In a small outdoor theatre, a single scroll containing Gallio's performance was hung above the stage. Then each evening for a week the same play was performed, backwards. Scene by scene, act by act, the actors recited the lines in reverse order, ending with the opening, beginning with the death, unravelling the drama into nonsense and mockery. The audience, invited but not charged, laughed, puzzled, jeered. The rhythm of the poetry, once admired, was revealed as hollow, dependent not on meaning but theft. Gallio was never mentioned, but he was present, seated by obligation in the front row each night. By the final performance, he no longer watched the stage. Elsewhere, in a villa by the field of Mars, a widow named Domitia faced judgment for something Rome rarely punished publicly. She had buried her husband with false honours. The man had died a minor equestrian, modest in stature, but she had paid for a funeral with all the trappings of a decorated general: laurel crowns, golden urn, a funeral pyre built with military banners. She had even bribed a trumpeter to play the imperial morning call. Rome's censors discovered the fraud. The punishment, funis revocatum, the recalled funeral. The tomb was opened, not desecrated but revealed. The laurel crowns removed, the banners folded and returned to the state armory. The golden urn was replaced with one of terracotta. The trumpet was sounded once more, but this time as a reversal, the notes broken, halted mid-call. Domitia was made to walk the route of the original funeral again, but in reverse, starting at the tomb, returning to her home, her attendants reduced to a single servant. No one greeted her. And though she remained wealthy and still hosted dinners, the shadow of that reversed procession seemed to linger at her threshold. Her name fell from invitation lists. Her likeness faded from portrait walls. All across Rome, punishments rippled not just through flesh but through identity, through perception, through the rituals that bound people to memory, to role, to city. Rome did not forget its symbols. It made them bleed, made them weep, made them reflect, recite, kneel, reverse, and in so doing made the punishment not just a moment, but a legend. The wind that drifted through the alleyways near the Forum Holitorium carried the smell of aging fruit and wilting herbs, a fragrance thick with the sweetness of overripe figs and the faint sting of spoiled leeks. Market stalls, mostly shuttered for the midday rest, stood like hollow ribs along the paved road, and the city dozed in golden silence, heavy with heat. But within the shadowed portico of the temple of Carmenta, goddess of prophecy and childbirth, a judgment of peculiar elegance was unfolding. A scribe named Volusius had committed a crime not easily seen and even less easily proven. He had altered public omens, not the signs themselves but the dates upon which they were said to occur. The readings, posted on public tablets for the people to interpret their fates, had been subtly changed. A bad omen moved forward 2 days. A good one delayed. He had done so on commission, for patrons who needed time to act or to stall. The omens were still true, but their timing was not. For a city that breathed by augury, this was more than forgery. It was an interruption of divine rhythm. His punishment was tempus fractum, the broken hour. He was summoned to the temple at dawn, and there a water clock was placed before him. It was a fine instrument, with thin lines of bronze filigree tracing the glass, and a slow, deliberate drip marking the passing moments. But this clock had been tampered with. The drip moved not with time, but with irregular pulses, rapid for minutes, slow for hours, pausing at intervals without warning. Volusius was ordered to sit before it, alone, and record each change with a stylus on wax. Every shift, every hesitation, every unnatural rhythm. He was not allowed to sleep, not allowed to speak, only to mark. He lasted 2 days before collapsing. When he awoke, the wax was taken, and each mark he had made was carved into the wall of a side chamber of the temple, a visible chaos of time undone. It remains there still. In the shadow of the Capitoline, another sentence was prepared, one shaped not by priests or lictors, but by the city's own streets. A wealthy freedman named Tertullus had diverted an aqueduct channel to flow into his private bathhouse, weakening the supply to an entire neighborhood. It had taken weeks to discover. Meanwhile, the laundresses, butchers, and grain washers of the district had worked with trickles and buckets, believing the gods or misfortune were to blame. His punishment was unda revocata, the returned water. Tertullus was brought, naked but robed in linen soaked with oil, to the cistern beneath the city, where the aqueduct had been tampered with. There, a single pipe was uncapped. A torrent of cold water rushed over him, knocking him to the ground. He was made to lie flat while the water passed over his chest, then his back, then his face. It was not enough to drown, but enough to steal breath. Each section of the pipe was uncapped in turn. Each section released its flow over him, until the last was opened, the strongest, directed not at his body, but at the entrance of his own villa, flooding his courtyard with the water he had once stolen. No coin could dry that shame. In a villa nestled in the grove near the Temple of Ceres, a slave girl named Livilla faced a very different kind of sentence. She had not stolen. She had not killed. But she had dared to touch the family's sacred implements, those used during rites of the harvest festival, and had used them in private mimicry, pretending to be the lady of the house. She had laughed, worn the wreath, poured libations with perfume instead of wine. It had been a game, played alone in the garden, but a servant had seen, and the house matron, furious at the desecration, demanded not punishment but understanding. Livilla's sentence was imitatio veritatis, the imitation of truth. For 1 full day she was dressed as the domina, not in mockery, but in full seriousness. She wore the jewellery, the dyed stola, the garland. She ate at the table's head, and servants attended her with deference. She was addressed as Domina Livilla, and as the day passed, she was made to perform every duty of the house mistress, mediating disputes, instructing cooks, reviewing household accounts. She smiled at first, then faltered, then wept. At sunset the garments were removed, the wreath was taken from her brow. She returned to her place in the kitchen without protest, but something had changed. The house matron, watching from afar, saw a new stillness in her eyes. And in later years, when the matron's own daughter died in childbirth, it was Livilla who was named steward of the household. Quietly, without ceremony. Elsewhere in the heart of the forum, a spectacle of language unfolded around a young grammarian named Fabius Maximus Caecilianus, who had written and circulated false etymologies, origins of words twisted for comedy, for insult, for subtle rebellion. He had claimed, for instance, that rex came not from regere, to rule, but from rex, a fictional root implying to shout nonsense. His work had been read aloud by students in laughter, passed from scribe to scribe. The punishment issued was verbum lapsum, the fallen word. Fabius was brought before the rostra, not to be flogged, but to speak. A list of corrupted words was presented to him. He was made to recite each one correctly, and then explain his false version. For every invented meaning, a child was brought forward to say what they had believed because of him. One thought kings were madmen. One thought mothers were cursed. One believed temples were named for tombs. At the end, Fabius was made to write the correct origins upon clay tablets, which were then broken. A symbolic act, correction offered too late. His writings were never banned, but they were taught as warnings. And his name, once sharp with wit, softened in the mouths of teachers who spoke it only as caution. Throughout the empire, Rome's strange and shifting punishments pressed not just against the body, but against the threads that tied men and women to meaning. Language, time, birth, truth, water, and silence. Every transgression unraveled one of those threads, and every sentence wove them back, crooked sometimes, but tighter, firmer, impossible to ignore. The city did not forget. It stitched its memory into ritual, into stone, into tears shed without violence, into the rhythm of everyday life, where the echo of judgment passed softly from hand to hand, like a secret no one needed to speak aloud. The moon rose pale and swollen over the rooftops of the Esquiline Hill, catching the edges of copper guttering and the smooth domes of forgotten shrines. In the distance, dogs barked once, then fell silent. The streets were near empty, save for the slow movement of a covered cart trundling along the Via Labicana, its wheels wrapped in linen to soften the sound. The cart bore no emblem, no signal, only a faint scent of wax and myrrh. Inside, a single object sat beneath a sheet of dark cloth, a wax mask, cracked across the cheek, with eyes that had never blinked. It belonged to a man named Gellius Iulus, a once celebrated orator who had fallen not by sword or exile, but by a quieter kind of betrayal. He had forged a supplicatia, a decree of thanksgiving meant to honour a general after victory. With bribed votes and clever oration, he had manipulated the Senate into awarding it to his cousin, an ambitious military tribune whose victory was modest at best, whose campaign had been more retreat than triumph. Rome had celebrated the lie. Altars were built, songs were sung. But then came the letters from the frontier, cold, bloodless, detailed. The truth was made plain. The punishment was silentium laudis, the silence of praise. Gellius was brought to the temple of Onos just before midnight. He wore no chains, no formal robe. A procession of senators and scribes followed him, not in honour, but in ritual neutrality. The cracked wax mask, modelled on his own face during his years of fame, was carried behind, unwrapped only as they reached the temple steps. There, a single herald read aloud the text of the false decree. Then, one by one, those present were invited to remove a word. Each word erased was scraped from the wax mask, until by the end, nothing remained of its features but a blank curve of flesh-coloured wax. Eyes, nose, mouth, all gone. The mask was returned to the cart, taken outside the city and buried beneath a nameless cairn. Gellius was not imprisoned, but he was forbidden from public speech. Not by law, by refusal. No one printed his words again. No one recorded his thoughts. His last appearance was at a funeral where he moved his lips during the eulogy, but no sound came. Across the river, near the sloping gardens of Janiculum, a punishment of more physical simplicity unfolded in the quiet chambers of a public granary. A group of warehouse keepers had been caught manipulating grain weights, using false stones, shaved measures, water-soaked sacks to inflate deliveries. The crime had long been suspected, but only recently proven. Their sentence was not flogging, not prison, but pondus veritatis, the weight of truth. In a small walled courtyard, the false stones were assembled into a circle, each marked with the name of the man who had used it. The true weight, carved from white marble, engraved with an unchanging measure, was placed at the centre. Each man, barefoot, was made to walk the circle, carrying the marble weight upon his shoulder. Not running, not collapsing, just walking, one circuit for every false measure used in their records. Some took an hour, some took 3. Their footprints, sunken into the soft clay path of the courtyard, were left untouched. A record of weight borne, of crime redeemed not by suffering, but by balance. On the southern slope of the Quirinal Hill, a punishment born from the theatre of sound was imposed on a street musician named Sira, whose melodies had once charmed the city's youth but had turned sharp in recent years. She had begun composing verses that mocked certain noble houses, mimicking their scandals with sly rhymes and veiled harmonies. At first it was tolerated. Rome enjoyed a clever tongue. But when her songs were echoed by children and scrawled upon the steps of temples, the line was crossed. Her sentence was cantus fractus, the broken song. She was brought to a colonnaded square at twilight where her lyre was restrung, not with gut but with reeds soaked in vinegar, brittle and humming with tension. She was given 1 hour to play. Every time a string snapped, she was to pause, wait, and begin again. The snapping came sooner with each chord. By the end, her lyre was silent, splintered into parts that no longer sang. She was allowed to leave, her hands unstained. but her instrument was hung in the marketplace, a single scroll pinned beside it. Let songs build, not rot. In the temple of Salus, patroness of health and the well-being of the people, another punishment had been conceived for a physician named Artemitus, who had falsely declared dozens unfit for public duty, accepting coin from their families in exchange for forged notes of weakness, coughs, imaginary fevers. The Senate's response was diagnosis inversa, the inverted remedy. Artemitus was summoned to the temple steps, where a line of patients stood, none truly ill, but all volunteers. For each, he was made to offer a diagnosis aloud, based only on a brief glance and a question. Then priests brought forth the real records, declaring the truth, strength, clarity, youth. With each false pronouncement, Artemitus's own robe was reversed, turned inside out, then outside in again, each layer stitched with painted organs, muscles, bones. By the time he reached the 10th patient, he wore a parody of anatomy, his own body exposed in absurd display. He was not banned from medicine. But every patient who came to him afterward asked, before any other question, if he was still wearing the robe. And at the edge of the forum, in a shaded niche between two statues, one of concord, one of discord, a solitary tablet was erected to mark a final punishment that day. It bore no names, only the phrase, lex invenit formam, the law finds a form. In Rome, every lie, spoken, sung, carved into stone, was matched by a shape, a ceremony. A correction that did not always draw blood, but always left a mark. And the city, with its endless appetite for memory, held these forms like relics, not only to remember what had gone wrong, but to teach, quietly, what must never be forgotten. The bells of the temple of Juno Regina rang twice in the crisp morning air, their soft peal echoing down the steep stone steps of the Clivus Publicius and settling like a hush over the sleeping city. Below, the Tiber shimmered beneath a veil of mist, and across the forum, traders unlatched their carts in silence, heads bowed. Today, a rare and almost sacred punishment would unfold, not for blood nor blasphemy, but for a fracture deeper and quieter than both. A man named Casicelius Pulcher had broken an oath of sodalitas, the ancient bond of fellowship between those in religious brotherhoods sworn to secrecy, unity, and ritual. He had leaked sacred formulas from the cult of Sol Invictus to a merchant faction seeking to mimic divine rites for profit, not out of malice, simply for coin. The rituals once chanted in mystery were soon echoed in bathhouses and taverns, sold as charms, degraded into fashion. The punishment decreed was sodalium in tenebris, fellowship in darkness. At twilight, Caecilius was led to the hall of the Collegia, the gathering place of Rome's sacred fraternities. He was not bound nor clothed in disgrace. Instead, he wore his ritual garb, clean and folded, and entered the hall alone. Inside, the chamber was pitch black. There were no torches, no voice spoke, but he could hear breathing, the rustle of robes, the slow circling of unseen feet around him. His fellow Sodales were present, hidden by the dark, and their silence was the sentence. For an entire night, he stood surrounded by what he had betrayed. Whispers passed near his ears, lines of the prayers he had sold but spoken in broken fragments. A cup was pressed into his hands, empty. A scroll laid across his palm, blank, each moment a mockery of what he had once held sacred. When dawn came, the doors opened, and he stepped out alone. From that day forward, no brother of any religious sodality would eat with him, greet him, or meet his gaze. He continued to walk the streets, still wealthy, still well-dressed, but alone. Rome had not killed him, it had emptied him. Elsewhere, in the wide plaza near the Baths of Trajan, a very different punishment was being enacted in bright daylight, before a murmuring crowd of artisans, beggars, and awestruck children. A pair of identical twins, Marcius and Decimus, had for years engaged in deception that played upon the city's love of drama. They had taken turns posing as the same man in court and commerce, appearing alternately as witness, trader, even lover to different women. Their mimicry had grown legendary until a botched funeral exposed them both. One had stood among the mourners while the other greeted guests in the atrium. Their punishment was called gemina separatio, the sundering of twins. Each was clothed in the same tunic, the same sandals, the same bracelet, and paraded down separate streets. Every onlooker was invited to call out what made them different: voice, gait, habit. At the forum, they were brought together once more, and an artist, blindfolded, was made to sculpt a bust of each using only touch, guided by the murmurs of the crowd. When the sculptures were unveiled, they did not look the same. One smiled, one frowned, and it was said the likeness captured something no mirror could reveal. The busts were placed in a public garden not far from the temple of Castor and Pollux. One was labelled Truth, the other Pretender. No one was told which was which. In the theatre district near the Tiber Island, a punishment of memory and imagination unfolded upon a woman named Calavia, a stage writer who had stolen entire fables from a Greek playwright recently dead, translating them line by line and claiming them as her own. The city had adored her plays, until an actor, familiar with the originals, unveiled the theft by reading both scripts aloud in a private gathering. Her punishment was fabula devorata, the devoured tale. A banquet was prepared in the public square. The tables were set not with food but with scrolls, dozens of them, copies of her works bound with ribbon. Guests were invited to sit, open the scrolls, and read aloud while eating plain bread and drinking sour wine. After each reading, the scroll was burned in a brazier shaped like a lion's mouth, the traditional symbol of discarded speech. Calavia sat alone at the head of the table, given nothing to read, nothing to drink, only to watch. By nightfall, not a single copy remained. Her name was no longer listed among the playwrights whose works were stored in the public library. But fragments of her stolen lines still lived, drifting among the mouths of those who had read them, meaningless now, disjointed, scattered, but remembered nonetheless. On the outskirts of the Celian Hill, in a small shrine to the spirits of crossroads, Lares Compitales, a punishment unlike any other was conducted for a man named Numerius, a builder who had cut corners in the construction of a bridge near Ostia. It had collapsed in a storm. No one had died, but 3 carts of grain had sunk into the river, and the town had nearly starved before supply could be restored. The punishment was iter ruptum, the broken path. Numerius was commanded to walk the exact path that his bridge had once crossed, not along the riverbank but through it. At low tide he was led down to the muddy shallows, his boots filled with gravel, his legs bound with hemp to slow his steps. As the sun rose above the water he walked, step by sloshing, stumbling step, while onlookers stood upon the rebuilt bridge watching in solemn quiet. Halfway through he slipped. He did not cry out. He continued. When he reached the far shore he was greeted not with jeers but with silence. Then the local priest pressed into his hands a small model of the new bridge, carved in olive wood. Not to honour, to remind. And last, in a shaded corridor beside the temple of Vesta, a young woman named Prima was being judged. Not for crime, but for impersonation in spirit. She had been seen wearing a pure white stola, hair veiled like a priestess, reciting half-remembered litanies in the street, offering blessings for coin. She was mad, some said. Inspired, said others. But the temple did not tolerate imitation. Her punishment was ignis absens, the absent flame. She was brought to the temple steps and seated before an unlit hearth. A crowd gathered, expecting spectacle, but none came. For 3 hours she sat, hands open, before a cold circle of stone. No words were spoken, no fire was kindled. Finally, the priestess approached and gave her a single taper of white wax. "If it lights," she said, "you may stay." Prima held it, stared at it, said nothing, then rose, turned, and walked away without lighting it. No curse, no chains, only a silence deeper than fire. Rome, in its endless ingenuity, punished not with thunder, but with mirror, mask, and metaphor, with empty hearths and reversed names, with hands that did not strike but shaped, and the city, carved in shadow and flame, remembered still. The afternoon sun hung like a dull coin above the rooftops of the Subura, where the tightly packed tenements cast jagged shadows across alleys lined with fishmongers and street magicians. The scent of boiling olive brine mingled with the sharp tang of iron from a nearby smithy, and the noise of the city, a perpetual thrum of sandals on stone, arguments over price, the low drone of poets rehearsing in corners, seemed almost to drown out the quiet procession of a single man being led up the hill toward the old Servian wall. His name was Lucanus Crispus, and he had been a censorial clerk, an archivist of the city's records, keeper of the rolls that documented births, deaths, citizen oaths, and ancestral claims. But over 3 seasons he had erased a single name. It was a small alteration, one line removed from the rolls of a lesser family whose ancestral claim to citizenship depended on that line. Without it, they lost their vote, their status, their right to bring charges in a court of law. He had done it not for money, nor grudge, but for convenience. He had disliked the family's insistence, their stubborn clinging to a paper-thin legacy. In one moment, with one smudge, he had consigned them to the margins. His punishment was nomen vacuum, the empty name. Lucanus was led to a high wall at the edge of the city, where a vast scroll had been painted in red ink, imitating the public registers he once tended. It bore dozens of names, fictitious and real, carefully composed with elegant hands. At the centre was a blank space. He was made to take a stylus and write his own name into the space. Then, with the same stylus, to scratch it out. Again and again the scroll was replaced. Again and again he wrote and then erased. By the 6th scroll, his hands trembled. On the 12th, he hesitated. By the final one, he merely pressed the stylus into the parchment, never writing at all. The scrolls were collected, folded and stored in the tabularium, not as records, but as caution. And Lucanus, once a man of ink and memory, lived the rest of his life denied the right to submit his own name on any legal document. He remained, but his presence was like fog, seen but not recorded. Elsewhere, beneath the arching canopy of sycamores near the Pons Sublicius, a more theatrical punishment was taking place for a group of 3 young men, known for their habit of shouting false alarms in the city. They had, over many nights, cried out warnings of fires that did not exist, ambushes that never came, uprisings in the street. They did it for pleasure, for chaos, to see the night watch stir and scatter, to watch people rush from their homes in confusion. But when a real fire broke out in a wine storehouse and no one came, believing it just another of their pranks, the cost was undeniable. Their punishment was vox derelicta, the abandoned voice. A stage was erected at the bridge's edge, facing the water. Each man was given a bell and instructed to cry out, "Fire! Fire!" No one responded. Each bell rang. Each voice rose. But the crowd, instructed beforehand, remained motionless, silent. For an hour the men called out, until their cries turned to pleas. Their voices cracked, their hands dropped, the bells fell silent. Then a final signal was given, and a child, only one, stood and mimicked their call perfectly. The crowd erupted in laughter, not scornful but knowing, a reflection. The 3 were never heard shouting again. Further north, in the hills near the sacred grove of Ferentina, an older punishment, barely remembered by even the most aged of priests, was revived for a woman named Malia, a widow who had secretly buried her slave lover in her family tomb. The law forbade it. Not for cruelty, but for ritual purity. The tomb was consecrated to her gens, and the dead outside that lineage were not permitted burial within its sacred soil. Yet she had done it anyway, in the dark of night, out of love, or grief, or both. The Senate's decision was hesitant, tempered with sympathy. But tradition demanded response. Her sentence was sepulchrum divisum, the divided grave. Malia was brought to the edge of the tomb, where 2 graves now lay open, one where the man had been buried, the other dug beside it. She was made to stand between them. Then priests of the Arval Brethren raised their hands and chanted the lineage of her family on one side and the laws of the servile on the other. Each line recited was matched by a stone placed between the graves. When they finished, the line of stones marked a perfect divide. She was not forced to remove the body. She was not made to speak. But she was never again permitted to cross that line. When she died, she was buried at a temple's edge, not with her family, not with him, but equidistant, neither denied nor permitted. In a shaded taberna near the Forum Boarium, a punishment unfolded that was as much a celebration of truth as it was a warning. A poet named Domitianus had grown famous by writing verses that praised men he had never met. He would accept payment from senators, generals, and merchants, then compose sonnets that painted them as heroes, philosophers, demigods. His crime was not slander, but excessive flattery. The punishment, laudes fictae, the false praises. Domitianus was seated at a wooden table in the centre of the tavern, where he was known to perform his readings. One by one, men whom he had praised were invited to step forward and speak the truth about themselves, openly, plainly. A general admitted cowardice. A senator confessed to ignorance. A merchant spoke of the lies he told to acquire land. After each admission, Domitianus was required to rewrite his poem aloud to match the new truth. Not mockingly, sincerely. He did so, with a bowed head and quill in hand. By the end, the audience applauded, not with mirth, but with quiet respect. He was allowed to continue writing thereafter, but his subjects chose him, never again the other way around. In Rome, punishment was not simply a rebalancing of scale. It was a form of retelling, a reweaving of the frayed edges of the city's fabric. Through silence, reversal, memory, and imitation, those who crossed the invisible lines that held the world in place were returned, not to shame alone, but to a deeper form of recognition, the kind that could be spoken or unspoken, seen or only felt, but always, always remembered. In the violet hush of evening, the light faded slowly from the golden rooftops of the Capitoline Hill, softening the outlines of temples and statues until they looked almost like memories carved from air. The city seemed to exhale, the loud commerce of the day retreating behind shuttered doors, leaving only the distant hum of fountains and the scratch of sandals on stone. In the Temple of Concord, nestled in the heart of the Forum where Rome pretended, just briefly, to be at peace with itself, a punishment was underway for an offence most delicate, most insidious, the theft of silence. His name was Silanus Varro, a philosopher by claim, a man who hosted salons where the elite gathered to speak of ethics, virtue, the soul, the stars. But Silanus had, without consent, recorded those conversations and offered them to publishers. He had captured the private words of men and women who had believed themselves safe in the company of equals. He turned their doubts, their half-formed theories into coin. What he had stolen was not information, it was vulnerability. Trust. His punishment was silentium percussum, the struck silence. He was brought into the great chamber of the temple where echoes lived longer than breath, and there a stone platform had been placed at its centre. Upon it sat a bronze bell, wide as a man's shoulders, suspended by a single chain. Silanus was instructed to speak a sentence aloud. Any sentence. He did. His voice trembled, a thought on harmony. Then the priest struck the bell. Its deep tones swallowed the chamber, muffling all else. Silanus tried again. Another sentence, another toll. Each time he spoke, the bell answered, louder, slower, until his voice could no longer be heard at all. He remained there through the night, repeating ideas, swallowed each time by the sound that outlasted him. At dawn, the bell was stilled, and he was led from the chamber. He never spoke in public again. And far from the hills and temples, in the bustling taverns of the Aventine, a merchant named Herennius paid the price for a different kind of theft, one of flavour, of memory, of hunger. He had built a reputation on a single sauce, a rare and savoury blend served at festivals and weddings, said to be learned from the kitchens of Alexandria. But in truth, the recipe had been taken from an old slave who had died years earlier, her notes sold in a bundle of household scrolls. Herennius had claimed it as his own invention. He gave no credit, only his name. The punishment was gustus absconditus, the hidden taste. A feast was prepared in his honour. He was made to sit at the head of the table while course after course arrived. Each dish looked familiar, roasted larks, honeyed dormice, fish in fig sauce. But every flavour was just slightly wrong. Too bitter, too sweet, oversalted, undercooked. Every plate a distortion of the original. At the final course, the true sauce was served, just once, without announcement. And it was not served to him. A child at the edge of the gathering tasted it, smiled and asked, "Who made this?" No answer was given. From that day no one bought Herennius's sauces again. His name still appeared in menus, in records, but not in mouths, not where it mattered. Further out, near the field of Mars where soldiers once drilled and boys now raced with sticks in hand, an older punishment, almost mythic, was reenacted for a man named Faustus, a herald who had lied. Heralds in Rome were sacred figures, messengers between the Senate and the people, between court and general, between oath and decree. But Faustus had accepted a bribe to alter the phrasing of a senatorial proclamation. One word. That was all. But that word shifted responsibility for a failed levy from the Senate to a single general. The man was publicly shamed, stripped of command. Only later was the truth discovered, scratched into the wax of a duplicate draft. Faustus's punishment was verbum vetitum, the forbidden word. A mask was crafted for him, pale wood shaped to his features, but with lips sewn shut in painted cord. He was made to wear it through the city, carried on a litter like a mute statue, while criers walked ahead of him reading the original proclamation, first as he had delivered it, then as it had truly been written. Behind him, another crier called out only one word: why? No answer was given. Not by him. Not by the Senate. The mask was eventually placed in the Hall of Records, above the scroll that bore his mark. Not as warning, as confession. And near the Janiculum's crest, where healers brewed medicines in ceramic pots and wild rosemary grew thick along the slopes, a punishment of rare restraint was passed upon a healer named Junior, who had promised too much. She had claimed to cure heartbreak, with herbs, oils, words whispered at the moon's highest point. She said she could restore a lover's affection, erase memory, dull grief. She took coin from women with sunken eyes, men who hadn't eaten for days, mothers who mourned sons still living. Her punishment was remedium inane, the hollow cure. She was summoned to a chamber with a single jar marked with her own symbol. Inside was water, clear and clean. She was told to drink. She did. Then 3 mourners entered. One by one, they asked her for healing, of loss, of absence, of betrayal. Each time she answered, a priest beside her asked, "Did the water help?" She said nothing. By the end of the day, the jar was empty. Her mouth was dry, her hands trembled. The jar was placed in a niche overlooking the city, beside a line carved in Old Latin: "What cannot be healed should not be sold." Rome understood the weight of silence, of taste, of names and shadows. It understood that not every punishment need draw blood, that to erase, to invert, to reflect, to do these with dignity, was to preserve more than order. It was to preserve Rome itself. The sky above the Campus Martius blushed faintly with the first hints of dawn. A delicate strip of rose-tinted cloud stretched above the pale silhouettes of colonnades and the outline of the Pantheon's dome. The torches that had lit the walkways during the night guttered out slowly, their smoke trailing like ancient breath into the morning air. In the eastern quarter, where the houses of astrologers and mystics leaned like aged bones toward the Tiber, a quiet rite was unfolding, one so old and so rarely used that even the priests conducting it spoke with hesitation. A man named Aemilius Parthenos had prophesied falsely. Not through simple error, Rome had long tolerated the unpredictability of the stars, but through deliberate craft. He had studied the horoscopes of senators, consuls, even the Pontifex Maximus himself, then rewritten them in subtle ways, adjusting rising signs, moving birth hours, omitting conjunctions. With these manipulated readings, he whispered both warning and promise. "You are destined," he said, "or doomed." And in the fragile twilight between ambition and fear, great decisions were made. Wars hesitated, votes postponed, marriages dissolved. A dozen lives turned by half a sentence written in the stars. His punishment was Sidus Falsum, the false star. At midnight he was brought to the Temple of Mercury, patron of messages and misdirection. The ceiling of the inner sanctum had been painted with the constellations in gold leaf centuries ago, their positions calculated with terrifying precision. Beneath this dome, Aemilius was made to lie on a low couch, his limbs bound loosely in linen cords dyed blue. Priests moved in silence around him. Each bore a thin rod tipped with glowing coal. One by one, they pointed to the stars above, naming each aloud in order, calling them as witnesses. Then, one by one, they extinguished the stars from view, releasing thick clouds of incense that clung to the air, obscuring the constellations. When the chamber was fully veiled in smoke, the priests withdrew, and Aemilius was left alone with only a single lamp by his head, its flame flickering low, unsteady, not unlike a dying star. He emerged at sunrise with red eyes and shaking hands, not because of torture, but because he could no longer see the sky without questioning its truth. High on the Aventine, beside a shrine to the goddess Pax, a punishment of slow irony was prepared for a wine merchant named Gallienus, who had sealed his barrels with waxes perfumed like imported vintages, fooling the noses of patricians and tricking connoisseurs into believing they drank the rarest wines of Greece and Gaul. He had bottled mediocrity and sold it as memory. His punishment was odor mendax, the lying scent. A great amphora was placed in the center of the city square, carved with ivy and vines. Around it, bundles of herbs, petals, spices, and oils were stacked, each marked only by color. Gallienus was blindfolded and led to the amphora. Then, instructed by the crowd, he was told to blend a scent, a single fragrance to match the wine he had claimed to sell. He tried. Cardamom, thyme, must, lavender, anise. He blended, adjusted, hesitated. The crowd watched in silent fascination. By midday, a faint, cloying aroma rose from the amphora. A child was called forward. He smelled the mixture, then said simply, "This is not it." The amphora was sealed, not smashed, but sealed, and placed near the arch of the Argentari, with a plaque reading, "He sold us memory, but it did not return." To the south, in the valley between the Celian and Palatine hills, a scholar named Servilia awaited judgment not for what she had written, but for what she had removed. A historian of considerable repute, she had authored a scroll on the ancient queens of Rome, recounting their deeds, wisdom, betrayals, and deaths. But one queen was missing, Tanaquil, the Etruscan prophetess, wife of Tarquinius Priscus. Servilia had found her inconvenient, too foreign, too bold, too central to a story not easily owned by the newer nobility. The punishment was memoria excavata, the unearthed memory. A clay likeness of Tanaquil was sculpted, life-sized, and placed at the entrance of the Bibliotheca Ulpia. Servilia was summoned to sit before it each day for 1 full week and read aloud the sections she had omitted. There were no accusations, no shouting crowds, just a slow, steady recitation of history returned to its place. By the end of the week, the statue was not removed. It was not consecrated either. It remained, a silent clay guardian of the truth she had once buried. Elsewhere, near the crowded arcades of the Circus Flaminius, a punishment stitched itself across the life of a seamstress named Plautia, who had become famous for weaving intricate garments inscribed with subtle messages. Phrases hidden in the folds, names in the embroidery, allegiances declared in thread. At first, the city admired her cleverness, but soon her clients realized she had duplicated the patterns. That secrets they thought uniquely hidden on their backs were echoed on the robes of strangers. Alliances undone, marriages questioned, deals revoked. Her punishment was filum duplex, the double thread. She was given a single bolt of wool cloth, pure white, and ordered to embroider upon it the secrets she remembered. Every name, every phrase, every message she had copied and sold. The cloth stretched for 20 paces by week's end. It was not displayed. It was not destroyed. It was folded and left in the temple of Securitas, where no one spoke aloud, and where even the guards walked with softened steps. Rome had long known how to punish theft of money, of blood, of land. But here, in these strange and layered ceremonies, it punished something deeper. Theft of belief, of time, of presence, of silence, of memory. Its justice did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it embroidered. Sometimes it left only a statue or a scent or a name quietly returned to the sky. The final light of day slanted across the forum like the last breath of an old man, touching the tops of columns and rooftops in fleeting gold before fading into the blue hush of twilight. The paving stones, still warm from the sun, whispered the soft steps of passers-by who dared not speak too loudly now. Rome, ancient and ever-watching, held her breath as one final judgment was prepared. One unlike any other, not for theft or deceit, but for the forgetting of gratitude. Her name was Calpurnia Vesta, once a noblewoman of great beauty and voice, celebrated in every corner of the Palatine for her sponsorship of poets, her funding of libraries, her kind words to promising youths. She had lifted many from silence into verse, from obscurity into legacy. But as years passed and her wealth grew, she distanced herself from those she had once aided. She refused to acknowledge their dedications, rejected their letters, denied ever knowing them. Forgetting, in Rome, could wound more deeply than insult. Her punishment was gratia relicta, gratitude abandoned. One morning, Calpurnia was summoned to the portico of Livia, where scrolls and statues of old patrons lined the marble walk. There, a circle of her former protégés stood waiting, each holding an object she had once given. A pen, a coin, a ribbon, a single page of verse with her name etched in gold. One by one, they stepped forward and offered her their gifts again, not to keep but to hold for a moment, and then without word they turned and placed the objects into a great clay jar in the centre of the portico. Calpurnia, seated on a low stool beneath a tree, was told to watch but not to speak. The jar filled, with things, with silence, with memory. At dusk the jar was sealed and carried to the temple of Fides, goddess of trust. There it remained, not as accusation but as testament. Her name was not struck from the records. But it was not spoken in the temple again. Not long after, a new plaque was mounted on the outer wall of the shrine. It bore no title, no judgment, only a line from an anonymous poet she once sponsored. She gave words to others, but left none for herself. In the quiet hills beyond the Porta Collina, where olive trees grew thick among weathered stones, a small ceremony took place far from the crowds. It was not a punishment in the traditional sense, but it was the final reckoning of the unseen. An old man named Titus Hostilius had lived alone for years in the shadows of the city's rituals. He had not stolen, nor harmed, but for a lifetime he had observed the punishments of others with delight, crowding near processions, lingering at the edges of shame, whispering names to strangers as they passed the pillories. He took joy in disgrace that was not his own, fed on humiliation like honeyed wine. He had built nothing, saved no one, only watched. When he grew too frail to walk, the city acted with a rare and wordless judgment. His sentence was speculum solium, the mirror alone. One morning, a servant arrived at his door and left a mirror of polished tin bound in iron. Nothing else, no summons, no decree. Titus spent his last weeks facing it, every movement reflected back to him. Not distorted, not warped, just true, quiet, unflinching. When he died, the mirror was placed atop his burial mound. It bore no name. Elsewhere still, in the cool undercroft of the Basilica Julia, a final punishment was being set in motion for a group of men who had rewritten a law for their benefit, not by changing its words, but by burying its older version under stones, concealing it from the scribes who came seeking precedent. They had not broken the law. They had hidden its memory. Their punishment was lex exhumata, the law unearthed. A trench was dug in the basilica's floor, and the buried tablet retrieved. Cracked, worn, but intact. The men were made to sit on the cold floor while the text was read aloud in full, once for each of them, by a youth not yet of voting age. When the reading was done, they were made to copy the law by hand, letter for letter, mistake for mistake, no abbreviation. The copies were hung not in the curia, but in the public latrine by the Tiber, where even the humblest citizen could read what had once been hidden. Rome, in the end, did not only punish the crimes that spilled blood or broke stone. It punished what unmade memory, what defaced dignity, what turned reverence into forgetting. Each punishment, from the lightest to the most grievous, served one purpose: to remind the city of what it was. Not just a place of roads and aqueducts, temples and triumphs, but a place of reckoning, of echoes that never fully died. In its quiet ceremonies and strange inversions, Rome carried its justice like a shadow, not always visible, but ever present, reaching backward and forward across generations. And in the stillness after the last name was spoken, after the final mask was removed and the final flame extinguished, the city remained, watching, waiting, whole.